Coming up next, it's a discussion of fetal tissue transplants. The House Energy and Commerce Subcommittee on Health and the Environment met Monday and heard from a number of medical professionals and researchers. Also on hand were representatives from medical research organizations such as the Epilepsy Foundation of America, the American Paralysis Association, and the Juvenile Diabetes Foundation. We will hear from a professor of theology and a retired U.S. Court of Appeals judge.
Meeting of the subcommittee will come to order. Spinal cord injury, Parkinson's disease, and diabetes cripple and kill millions of Americans. For years, people with these conditions have hoped for medical breakthroughs, and for years, nothing was found. Breakthroughs are now being found, but the Bush administration has ordered the National Institutes of Health to ignore them, not because of concern about their scientific merit, but because of misplaced allegiance to the most extreme elements of the anti-abortion movement. Because these research projects involve the transplantation of fetal tissue rather than organs or tissue from adults, the Bush administration has decided to abandon all such research and give up hope. This is wrong scientifically and ethically. Let's be clear at the outset. This is not research on living fetuses, on potentially viable fetuses, or on newborn babies. This is research on tissue of fetuses that are dead, with no viability, and not even potential life. Such research has genuine potential for saving lives. Preliminary results indicate progress using fetal tissue toward curing, not just treating, but actually curing metabolic diseases, neurological diseases, and even those genetic disorders that affect living fetuses and newborns. When NIH funding of such research was first begun, questions of ethics were raised by the Reagan administration. A moratorium on such projects was instituted, and a panel of reviewers was chosen by the NIH, many of them who were also opposed to keeping abortion legal. That review concluded that fetal transplantation research has great promise, that only the most abstract risk of abuse exists, and that ethics guidelines are in place to prevent such abuses from taking place. Under current law, no sale of tissue is allowed, neither is specific donation from a pregnant woman to a potential recipient. But the Bush administration has overturned the NIH recommendation to fund such research. By doing so, the administration has shown greater respect for the most radical members of the anti-abortion constituency than for those Americans afflicted with such disabilities and diseases. The administration has implicitly told these Americans that the cure for their disease is too controversial to study, too political to pursue. The administration has abandoned scientific inquiry in favor of right-wing dogma. The rationalization of this know-nothing policy is that, despite all scientific evidence and advice to the contrary, the administration fears that American women might have more abortions so that they can contribute tissue to science. The administration has concluded this with no evidence, no backing in the NIH Director's Advisory Committee, and against the recommendation of its own expert panel. The policy is comparable to one of banning life-saving organ transplants to limit traffic accidents, and it's equally ludicrous. The administration decided, reviewers notwithstanding, that this is only a moral issue, not a moral issue about science to save lives, but one about abortion. It was decided that whatever else is done with the tissue from legal abortions, no one should learn anything from it. Don't research it, don't study it, don't find cures for disease in it. Instead, unlike a life-saving organ transplanted from a brain-dead adult, the fetal tissue will just be buried. There are legal questions regarding the administration's ability to issue such far-reaching prohibitions with no authority, no publication, and no procedures. There are policy questions on censorship, chilling of research, and scientific freedom. But most important, there are questions of science and morality regarding the decision to abandon research and hope for millions of Americans. We should not hold greater reverence for dead tissue than for living people. And we should not resign our public health responsibilities in favor of political rhetoric. This ban should be rescinded and research should go on. We have a number of witnesses to explore this issue with the subcommittee, but before I call on any of the witnesses, I want to recognize members of the subcommittee for opening statements and call on Mr. Bliley first.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. To give credibility to the barbaric practice of harvesting human fetal tissue. The word harvesting has not been used of late, probably because of the instinctive revulsion felt by a majority of people, but it is a more accurate description of what is at issue. Harvesting is the process of gathering in a crop, and that is how unborn children are viewed by the advocates of fetal tissue transplants, a lower life form to be used or disposed of as we, the fortunate born, see fit. I have called this a press event because the issue we are dealing with is clearly controversial, and no remarkably new information is likely to be presented to us today. It is evident to me that this hearing is an effort to attack the Secretary and the Assistant Secretary for Health for a decision they made in conscience after weighing views brought before them. The Secretary of Health and Human Services, taking under advisement the responses and recommendations of the NIH panel, concluded that the federal government should not fund research involving the harvesting of tissue from aborted children. Secretary Sullivan and Assistant Secretary Mason looked at NIH panel's recommendations and were persuaded that the source of the tissue is more than relevant. It is essential to determining whether such research is morally justified. The NIH panel was charged with assessing the legal and ethical issues surrounding the use of human fetal tissue. However, instead of seriously considering the ethical implications, the panel stopped short at the legality of abortion. It concluded that since abortion is currently legal, the potential for significant medical goals outweighs the moral relevance that human fetal tissue for research has been obtained from induced abortions. This is akin to a slave owner of the 1850s trying to convince an abolitionist of the economic benefits to be derived from slavery, since, after all, it was legal. Is it any wonder, then, that the Secretary and Assistant Secretary should make their own ethical analysis? If members do not believe that abortion is killing of a defenseless, innocent human being, then they should propose legislation authorizing or mandating that federal tissue research be funded. They should not, however, berate officers of the federal government for following their consciences and the administration's policy on such a fundamental ethical issue. The Secretary concluded rightly that federal funding of research using aborted children as tissue sources compromised the administration's consistent position that the federal government should not promote abortion in any way. We cannot truly assess the moral implications of such funding without looking at future applications of the research. To argue otherwise is either naive or duplicitous. Success is the goal, and we must look at the implications of success. If we review what some advocates of fetal tissue harvesting have to say about its implications on abortion decisions, it is clear that this connection cannot be dismissed. In a concurring opinion to the NIH report, which was signed by 9 NIH panel members who recommended federal funding of fetal tissue transplantation research, Professor John Robertson argues, and I quote, "If the situation changes so that the supply of fetal tissue from family planning abortions proves inadequate, the ban on donor designation of recipients and aborting for transplant purposes should be re-examined. The ethical and legal arguments in favor of and against such a policy would then need careful scrutiny to determine whether such a policy remains justified," unquote. Clearly, these panelists were not closing the door on the possibility of women conceiving and aborting a child for transplant purposes, should it be beneficial to the tissue recipient. Finally, if one granted that the legality of abortion makes the source of tissue irrelevant, which I do not, another critically important issue still needs to be addressed. It is not clear what measures are taken before tissue is harvested to ensure that an aborted child is in fact dead. In an article published in the Hastings Center Report in 1987, bioethicist Mary Mayowald and fetal tissue researchers Jerry Silver and Robert Ratchison acknowledged that the fetal brain may not yet be dead when brain tissues are harvested for transplantation. Moreover, they said it is morally defensible to remove tissues from non-viable fetuses while they are still alive. If dead fetuses are not available or are not conducive to successful transplants. While these babies may be sensitive to pain, this concern may be satisfactorily addressed on a practical level by using anesthesia, unquote. Mr. Chairman, let me make one thing clear. My objections to harvesting fetal tissue should in no way be taken as a lack of compassion for millions of people suffering from debilitating conditions. My own mother had Alzheimer's, so I know the pain this disease causes. However, I don't believe we should let our compassion blind us to the consequences of our actions. Aborted fetuses are not things, they are dead babies. We cannot lose sight of this. Mr. Chairman, I would like to include in the hearing record at the conclusion of my statement 2 news articles concerning the NIH panel. I thank the Chairman for his indulgence.
Thank you, Mr. Bliley. Mr. Sinai?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I had not intended to make an opening statement, but because of what Mr. Bliley said, I feel almost compelled to do so. First of all, let me commend you for what I think is going to be an excellent hearing. And let me express what is a sincere disappointment in my dear friend Mr. Bliley's statement. As I look at this panels that have been put together, I'm not aware of any hearing we've had that is this comprehensive in the areas of legal and ethical questions with respect to health that we've ever had in this committee. And I would find it hard to believe that a professor of theology or the Juveniles Diabetes Foundation or the American Academy of Pediatrics, the Epilepsy Foundation, and others who will be testifying would be part of any press event. I think that they really do have a sincere interest in this issue and want to discuss it today, and I commend you for giving them the opportunity to do it. There is no question this is one of the most emotional, divisive issues this country faces. But it is also an issue which the American public wants their elected officials to look at and to make decisions based upon facts and not the emotion. And hearings like this provide us the opportunity for reasoned, factual, legal, and ethical discussions which too often don't get done. And because of the simple fact that C-SPAN will be covering this today, to where the American public will have an opportunity on a variety of occasions over the next couple of days and weeks to review this, they will for the first time get more than a 30-second soundbite on picket lines on either side of this issue and help us as elected officials make better decisions on this very sensitive issue. I look forward to reading not only the testimony of today's hearing, but to following this with great interest, because all of us who have struggled with this issue politically realize that a reasoned, factual, legal, ethical decision is much better than the emotional decision which too often really drives this issue. And so I commend the Chairman for this hearing today.
Thank you very much, Mr. Sinar. Let me indicate that at the time there was an initial ban on fetal tissue transplantation research in March of 1988, a human fetal tissue transplantation research panel was established to study this research and to respond to 10 scientific, legal, and ethical questions posed by the Assistant Secretary for Health. The panel deliberated over a period of several months and presented its findings and recommendations in December of 1988. By a vote of 18-3, the panel concluded that the use of human fetal tissue is acceptable public policy and should be continued. The panel's report and recommendations were accepted on a unanimous vote by the Advisory Committee to the Director of NIH. The NIH Director, in turn, recommended to the Secretary of HHS that the ban on fetal tissue transplantation research be lifted and that this research be allowed to continue. That recommendation was, of course, rejected by the Assistant Secretary. This decision was eventually ratified by the Secretary. We're pleased to have as our first witnesses today at today's hearings several members of that human fetal tissue transplantation research panel. The Honorable Arlen Adams, chairman of the research panel, is a retired U.S. Court of Appeals judge and is currently in private law practice in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. Dr. Kenneth J. Ryan served as the panel's chairman for scientific issues. Dr. Ryan is chairman of the Department of Obstetrics and Gynecology at the Brigham and Women's Hospital in Boston. Also testifying as the panel's chairman on ethical and legal issues, Dr. Leroy Walters. Dr. Walters is director of Georgetown University's Center for Bioethics. And finally, we'll hear from the Reverend James T. Burchill, professor of theology at Notre Dame University. Reverend Burchill was a member of the research panel, and he was one of the dissenting votes in the 18-3 vote. And I'd like to ask all of those witnesses to please come forward and take seats at the table. We're pleased to welcome all of you to our hearing this morning. Your prepared statements will be in the record in full. What we'd like to ask from each of you is a limit on your oral presentation to no more than 5 minutes, so that we'll have a full opportunity to hear from all the witnesses and be able to have questions and responses to those questions from members of the subcommittee. Dr. Walters, I'd like to start with you, if you might. Judge Adams was the chairman. Perhaps we ought to start with you more appropriately.
Thank you very much.
If you pull the microphone closer.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman and members of this distinguished committee. It's always an honor to appear before any congressional committee. It was a similar honor to be chairman of the fetal research panel that you have adverted to. Your preliminary comments cover about one half of what I was going to say, namely the chronology of how this came about, going back to the spring of 1988 when Dr. Wyndham submitted the 10 questions to us via the head of NIH, Dr. Weingarten. You have already adverted to the fact that the panel was appointed during the summer of 1988. We had many presentations as well as oral hearings. We then went into a process of very intense discussions, very excellent discussions, I might say. And as a result of those discussions, began crafting answers to the questions. We believe that answers were not sufficient, so that we also gave explanations as to how the members of the panel thought about each of the questions. I'm not going to repeat those questions. They're in the materials that you have. They're available. The only thing I can do is really to repeat the statement that I made as chairman of the panel when I transmitted the report to Dr. Wyndham. And this is what I had to say. The questions posed by Dr. Wyndham to the panel and the concerns underlying those questions raise a number of difficult and indeed anguishing issues for me. I have been opposed to abortion, except in very limited situations, for a very long time. Yet I recognize that the Supreme Court of the United States has declared that a woman has a constitutional right in the first and second trimesters to proceed with an abortion. Although I have serious reservations regarding that Supreme Court opinion, both in its reasoning and its ultimate result, I recognize that Supreme Court decisions in matters of this type constitute the law of the land. Thus, until those decisions are reversed, all citizens are bound by them. Nonetheless, any activity which would serve as an inducement to women to have abortions must, in my view, be dealt with in a most cautious fashion, and to the extent possible, be carefully circumscribed. Counterpoised against the concerns set forth above is the evidence produced during the hearings, which indicate that there are a series of illnesses that might be substantially ameliorated by the prudent use of fetal tissue. although proof of the efficacious use of such tissue is not yet established beyond all peradventure, every indication is that research in maladies such as Parkinson's disease, Huntington's disease, childhood diabetes, and perhaps Alzheimer's disease can be considerably improved by the use of such tissue. Consequently, at least for me, the problem has been weighing one major concern, my objection to abortions, against another major concern, making it possible to do medical research that could improve the lot of thousands of our citizens in a rational fashion. Certainly, the prevention of any commercialization of this process would seem to me to be an absolute requirement. Also, the need to separate completely the abortion procedure and the use of the fetal tissue would seem to be an essential step, assuming that such a separation is possible. Further, it must be mandatory that any funding by the government be limited to situations which employ the most careful scientific approaches as well as the highest professional standards. Based on the evidence that has been made available, I believe, at least preliminarily, that these various safeguards are possible in today's environment. Accordingly, I would insist as a condition to providing for any approval that the National Institutes for Health commit itself to conduct periodic reviews from time to time and with great care to ensure that the concerns expressed here, as well as concerns that may be uncovered as medical research proceeds, are carefully safeguarded. One other element has tipped the balance so far as my own vote is concerned. In proceeding even with carefully crafted guidelines and on a periodic review basis only, I am troubled that without government funding, there undoubtedly would be many efforts to use fetal tissue for medical research that would be completely unsupervised and not governed by any reasonable guidelines. Thus, if the National Institutes of Health proceeds cautiously and with carefully articulated safeguards and a program of periodic reviews, there would be much greater assurance, at least to me, that carefully crafted guidelines will be put in place as an absolute condition to any further research procedures. Such an arrangement would protect pregnant women and fetuses in a far more circumspect and intelligent manner than if the NIH did not participate in any way. That concludes my statement, Mr. Chairman, and I'd be happy to answer any questions if there are any.
Thank you very much, Judge Adams. We'll hear from the other members of the panel, and then we do have some questions for you. Dr. Ryan, why don't we just move down the line on the table?
Mr. Chairman, I too appreciate being asked to testify this morning. I think it's a privilege. I want to speak on this moratorium. I believe that the imposition and continuation of the moratorium on this federal funding for transplantation involving the use of fetal tissue has several unfortunate consequences. I think the first one, it definitely impedes progress toward amelioration and perhaps cure of chronic debilitating diseases, such as Parkinsonism and diabetes, and thwarts the hope of approaching diseases like Alzheimer's disease and even acquired immune deficiency diseases. It withdraws hope and assistance to individuals suffering from such diseases at a time when all of our science can offer them so much more hope. Two, it creates a siege state of mind and a sense of government repression in conscientious scientists and physicians who are trying to advance knowledge and relieve suffering. Such moratoria have occurred several times in the past 17 years over moral standoffs, usually about abortion, and discourage all types of human research and recruitment of students into research careers. It has a ripple effect. Moratoria, furthermore, hardly become a religiously diverse democratic society that is supposed to be tolerant and have room for different values. Three, the moratorium creates, as Judge Adams alluded to, a moral vacuum for the oversight of such transplantation performed as clinical practice rather than research. And this undoubtedly will occur, it has occurred, and it will be without the force of federal guidelines if federal sponsorship of research is withdrawn. This moral vacuum has already occurred in the area of medically assisted reproduction, such as in vitro fertilization, where research was never allowed in this country, clinical practice was instituted, and Congress is still trying to catch up to establish standards for in vitro fertilization. Fourth, it cedes to other countries and societies the cutting edge of science and medicine and requires that we ultimately import another commodity that has heretofore been one of our greatest exports, scientific and medical progress. Notwithstanding all the foregoing, one could not justify the lifting of the moratorium if the moral arguments behind him were truly compelling. The moratorium was invoked to carefully consider the issues. Both the panel and the advisory committee recommended lifting the moratorium after deliberations which were conducted under full public scrutiny and published. The argument for maintaining the moratorium by the current Assistant Secretary is that if successful, the research might increase abortion. That argument was considered by the panel as justification for the moratorium and rejected by a vote of 19-1 with one abstention. That's question 2 in the panel report. The rejection was based both on the belief that it was unlikely that women would seek abortion for this type of research, and even if they did, the recommended safeguards which would separate the abortion from subsequent use of tissue would prevent such a process from taking place in federally funded programs. The panel also rejected the argument that abortion practices would change inappropriately if transplantation became more common by a vote of 19-2. The vast majority of the panel could separate their personal views on abortion from the subsequent research use of the tissue. The force of the Secretary's argument is further diminished by several other considerations. Research using fetal tissue from abortion has been conducted for over 30 years with federal funding, and there's no evidence that abortion has increased because of it. This is so even though fetal tissue has been used for the development of the polio vaccine and other important medical advances. On the contrary, it's likely that there might be undue coercion on women if transplantation is performed outside of a federally funded program without federal regulations. The use of human tissue from adults and children is allowed, in fact encouraged, for organ transplantation, has gained wide public support by keeping it out of the profit sector and monitoring it to prevent abuse. Other well-developed and humane countries, like Sweden, allow such research using safeguards which provided a model for those proposed by the panel if federal funding for transplantation was to be resumed. They report no evidence of abuse or a rise in abortion from Sweden. Finally, and I would say in Sweden, their teenage pregnancy is down. If the objective of the moratorium were truly to diminish or not increase abortion, then programs for preventing unplanned pregnancies would more vigorously be pursued by the Department of Health and would certainly have a greater impact than anything that could be accomplished by the moratorium. In summary, the reason why the moratorium is bad is because it holds up progress in relieving human suffering, it discourages our scientific community, it leaves the moral vacuum on an issue it's supposed to address, and it cedes progress in medicine and science to others. The reason the moratorium is not compelling from a moral perspective is that the argument offered for its continuation rejects the considered opinion of a diversely constituted group of citizens. The basis of the moratorium has no credibility in terms of history of other fetal research in this country and current research on transplantation in Sweden. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ryan. Dr. Walters?
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Bliley, the report of the NIH panel on which Judge Adams, Dr. Ryan, and I served was the 11th in a series of committee or parliamentary statements on ethical aspects of fetal tissue research or transplantation. Since the NIH panel completed its work and dissolved, 3 other statements have been published. Thus, from 1972 through 1989, there have been at least 14 committee or parliamentary statements on the ethics of fetal tissue research. 3 of these statements originated in the United Kingdom, 3 in the United States, 2 in Sweden, 2 with the Council of Europe, and 1 each in the Netherlands, Australia, France, and Canada. I've included a list of these 14 statements at the end of my prepared remarks. Despite the diversity of the cultures in which these 14 statements were drafted, a remarkable ethical consensus emerges from them. All 14 agree that research involving the study or transplantation of human fetal tissue is ethically acceptable in principle. The major ethical argument in favor of conducting such research is that it may produce scientific knowledge or therapeutic benefits that are unobtainable by other means. All 14 statements then add stipulations to their general acceptance in order to ensure that what is ethically acceptable in principle is also ethically conducted in practice. The stipulations require that only cadaver tissue be used and attempt to insulate the humanitarian use of fetal tissue from the abortion decision on the one hand and the commercial sphere on the other. Viewed from this perspective, the majority conclusions and recommendations of the NIH panel are quite unoriginal. They reflect the attempt of yet another conscientious group of women and men to wrestle with a set of complex ethical issues. In the end, a substantial majority of panel members voted to ratify the international ethical consensus reflected in previous committee statements. The burden of proof on the ethics of fetal tissue research rests on DHHS officials who would have U.S. public policy differ from this impressive ethical consensus. It is true that the question of performing human fetal tissue research or transplantation differs from the question of providing public funds for the conduct of such research or transplantation. Yet these two questions have been linked by Dr. Lewis Sullivan and Dr. James Mason. According to them, DHHS is continuing the moratorium on departmental funding for fetal tissue transplantation, note, not for laboratory research with fetal tissue, on ethical grounds. Two arguments are put forward. One, that knowledge of the possibility that fetal tissue could be used for transplantation would convince some women who are undecided about terminating a pregnancy to proceed to termination. And two, that this transplantation technique, if successful, could create a demand for large quantities of fetal tissue and, by implication, for more abortions. The second argument simply does not pertain to the research phase of fetal tissue transplantation, when only limited quantities of tissue would be needed. If, as I hope, further clinical research demonstrates conclusively that fetal tissue transplantation is beneficial to patients with Parkinson's disease or diabetes, DHHS and the society as a whole will face important decisions about funding for a new kind of transplantation therapy. However, those decisions can be made at that time on their merits. One factor to be considered in making those decisions will be the total amount of fetal tissue required to treat most or all candidates for therapy. In the meantime, alternative methods of therapy may become available, or new methods for preserving or amplifying cultures of fetal tissues may be developed. Thus, we should acknowledge that further decisions await us if this line of clinical research is successful. But we should not allow a prejudgment about the shape or outcome of those future decisions to count as an ethical argument against funding that line of research now. As for the other ethical argument that fetal tissue research will influence some undecided women to proceed with abortions, DHHS officials have adduced neither anecdotal nor survey evidence to support this argument. The majority of the NIH panel members were convinced both by the testimony of witnesses and of women panel members themselves that other questions generally predominate in women's moral decisions about abortion. Thus, I conclude that DHHS has provided no convincing ethical rationale for continuing the current moratorium on research involving the transplantation of human fetal tissue. There is one point on which the report of the NIH panel can, I think, be usefully supplemented by a subsequent statement. And I refer to the Polkinghorne Committee report presented to the British Parliament in July of 1989. That committee recommended the establishment of a national intermediary organization to serve as a fetal tissue bank, and that that organization be funded by a government grant to keep fetal tissue research and transplantation carefully insulated against commercialization. I would commend that idea to the Department of Health and Human Services.
Thank you very much, Dr. Walters. Reverend Burchell?
Mr. Chairman, before beginning, may I ask if it would be possible to enter into the record the dissenting statement of which I was the co-author, which appears at page 45 of the report of the Human Fetal Tissue Transplantation Research Panel.
We will be pleased to receive that. In fact, what the chairman would ask is unanimous consent to insert the whole record, both the majority and the minority opinions from that report.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, the Assistant Secretary for Health commended to our panel a consideration of ethical, legal, and scientific aspects of the use of human fetal tissue for transplantation research. I will speak only to that aspect, the ethical aspect, which indeed received the majority of our panel's attention. And if I may somewhat correct your initial statement, the concern of those of us who dissented was not that this was human fetal tissue, but that it had been obtained and was to be obtained through elective abortion. In all of our minds, that was the dominant issue. Now, I begin with three convictions which I believe were consensually held by all of us, all 21 of us. First of all, that the requirement, which is held since the Nuremberg trials, that no human subject be used for research without voluntary and informed consent, not in any way be ignored or endangered by such a line of research. Secondly, and this was held by all members of the panel, to my knowledge, regardless of their opinion on the morality of induced abortion, that such a sponsored program of research not in any way make the government complicit in abortions in the future by inducement or in the past by complicity after the fact. On those three grounds, we all stood together. It's my contention, however, that they were misapplied. The person to whom the majority looked as the appropriate giver of consent was the mother, who would consent to this after she had consented to the abortion. It is widely argued and understood that the mother who has given her decision to destroy her own offspring before birth has forfeited the only ground on which she would have to make a proxy decision while the unborn is still living. That is her protective role as guardian of her child. We argue that she abandons and abdicates her very possibility of giving authentic consent. Secondly, and this is the argument on which the Assistant Secretary has placed great weight, for two reasons, we see that the acceptance of this funding program by the federal government would be very likely to serve as an inducement for increased abortions. The first reason is that all social scientific studies show, and this is spread on the record of our dissent, that the decision to abort is a very difficult one, a very troubled one, and one in which the women find themselves in great ambivalence. For many of them, the only strong negative consideration is that they would be destroying their own child. And that naturally creates strong guilt. It is thought that for many young and in many cases troubled women, the prospect of doing at least some good after destroying their own child might prove to be a significant motive tipping the scales. But secondly, and equally important, this is, if accepted, going to be big business. If all of the fetal tissue presently made available through elective abortion were made available for this purpose, it would only suffice to provide treatments for 0.5% of diabetes sufferers and 2.5% of those who suffer Parkinson's disease. The argument sustaining those figures is in our dissent. With so many people suffering, surely a market is created which would be significant. The most highly capitalized corporation planning to offer such tissue sees $6 billion to be the market value for these two diseases alone. We think that this, which would not give payment for tissue, but would practically double the cash flow of the abortion industry, could not help but create an increased inducement on their part. Thirdly, and to my mind most tellingly, there would be a moral complicity after the fact with the abortions themselves. This has best been shown from the Nuremberg doctors' trial, where the German physicians who used both living and dead tissue for what they argued were very potentially beneficial research projects. These doctors claimed that these persons were killed with no participation by themselves, and that indeed it would be criminal and irresponsible and scientifically wrong on their part to let this tissue perish, be discarded without yielding some scientific benefit. In our statement, we have numerous quotations from the physicians who were cited at the Nuremberg trial and were condemned for having been complicit after the fact. This same reason is very operative today in the EPA, where the proposal to use the phosgene experiments aroused an enormous concern among the staff scientists. At the New England Journal of Medicine, where the editor refuses to publish any of the Nazi data for the reason that it might put them in a position of acquiescence. At the government of the Federal Republic of Germany, in response to the Jewish community in Germany, withdrew specimens of the Holocaust victims from German medical schools where they were still being used. We argue that to turn the abortion industry into a supplier of preference, to remedy very serious, or at least to attempt to remedy very serious diseases and handicaps, would do no more than treat one victim group as the target group whose interests would be forfeited so that another, to whom we are more sympathetic, would be helped. For that reason, I support the moratorium imposed by the Secretary.
Thank you very much, Reverend Burchell. Judge Adams, your panel was appointed by the National Institutes of Health, and it was made up of people with varying views on the question of abortion itself.
Right.
And your panel reached the conclusion by a vote of 18-3 to permit research to go forward using fetal tissue within certain guidelines and parameters to try to deal with these fears about the whole issue of abortion getting out of hand as a result of this fetal tissue question. Your recommendations then went on to the policymakers at the Department of Health and Human Services, and they just overturned what your panel overwhelmingly recommended. Why do you think that report of your committee was rejected?
I have no idea. I really don't. It's never been brought to my attention except by the statement of Dr. Sullivan that you're familiar with.
His statement was that his fear was that there would be an increase in abortions.
Very similar to the concerns that have been eloquently expressed by Dr. Burchell here today.
Do you believe that the decision to reject the committee's report was handled correctly? Any views on that?
At one time, I might have been politically astute. That's certainly not within my ken anymore. I'm more of a judicial thinker rather than a political thinker, and I'd rather turn that question over to somebody who knows more about the political aspects.
As I understand it, you yourself are opposed to abortion under most circumstances, and I would assume, therefore, you wouldn't want to do anything that would encourage abortion.
That is right.
Dr. Mason says that he and Dr. Sullivan believe that fetal tissue transplantation research will increase abortion, and Reverend Burchell expressed that fear. In one of the 10 questions put to the committee, you agreed that this possibility was highly unlikely. Do you believe that fetal tissue transplantation research will increase the number of abortions in this country, and why do you reject that argument that it will?
Based on the evidence that was produced before the commission, I could not, as a legally trained lawyer or judge, reach the conclusion that the evidence was at that time sufficient to sustain that finding or conclusion. But I hasten to tell the members of the commission that there should be periodic reviews conducted so that if evidence could be adduced which established that, that would very much alter my judgment.
Your view is that you didn't see that that was going to happen, and you wanted to take things within dealing with a real problem. On one hand, you have people suffering from very serious, terrible diseases, Parkinson's, Alzheimer's, diabetes. On the other hand, you didn't want to encourage abortions. Rather than take an either-or position, you wanted to say no commercial sale of these fetal tissue, to make sure that there could be no designated donation to encourage anybody to try to take care of a relative or a friend who suffered from a disease, and then, notwithstanding that, continue to watch it. Is that your approach?
Well, there were a few other conditions, such as separating, as Dr. Walters' testimony indicated, separating the decision to abort from the decision whether or not to use the tissue resulting from the abortion for medical research. There were a number of conditions, but I was one of those who felt probably more strongly than anyone else regarding periodic reviews with some frequency to make sure that the concerns expressed by Father Burchell did not come into play, because if they did come into play, I, for one, would feel quite differently about the process.
Dr. Ryan, you're affiliated with an obstetrics hospital, and you're a doctor yourself. Do you believe that that women have abortions to contribute to research?
I honestly do not believe so. None of the women on the panel believed so, and I just am sorry there are no women sitting here this morning, where I am.
Well, do you, they don't do it now, but I guess Reverend Burchell and others are fearful that when we see a greater need for fetal tissue, that they'll decide the moral question of abortion based on this rationalization that maybe they're going to be doing some good.
I want to try and answer that seriously. It's easy to be trivial about this, but the simple fact of the matter is that ever since abortion was legalized in 1973, the way abortion has been done, the timing, the way it's been done, and everything else has been done for the benefit of the pregnant woman, so that the cost, the procedure, the timing, the safety, all have been improved. They have all been improved without regard to any use that fetal tissue was being put to, and as a physician I would object to any deviation from that policy. I don't see that changing.
Dr. Walters, you talked about a moral vacuum. What did you mean by a moral vacuum? If we have a moratorium, do you expect research to go on anyway without some clear guidelines?
I don't believe I used the phrase moral vacuum.
Dr. Ryan did. Well, let me direct that to him. What did you mean by that?
Well, I gave the illustration with in vitro fertilization. We are not an isolated country. We live in one world, and research is going on all over the world. Unfortunately, people tend to introduce into clinical practice some of these ideas before they should. In vitro fertilization was a very good example. The Congress has held hearings on that, and they asked the question, why is it that we have so much chaos in terms of the regulation, standardization to protect the patients? And the answer is it crept into practice without the necessary research and the necessary federal guidelines to monitor that research, which should precede any clinical practice, I believe.
Thank you. Mr. Bliley?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Judge, who was it that contacted you from NIH about serving on this panel?
I think it was Dr. Weingarten, whom I had never met. I think he called me one day while I was in my office and said that my name had been suggested to him by 2 or 3 very distinguished citizens in the United States, and couldn't I please find time from my schedule to help out in a very difficult situation. That's my best recollection.
Did Dr. Weingarten contact you, Dr. Ryan, Dr. Walters?
No, I believe it was his assistant. He didn't call me directly.
I see.
Same for me.
Dr. Weingarten or his assistant?
I think it was Dr. Moskowitz who called me, yes.
I see. I mention that because Dr. Weingarten has been on record as opposing the administration's policy since 1982 on fetal tissue research. He's an advocate. And in fact, he appeared on television short after the appointment of the panel, strenuously arguing for it. So I mention that because it's not surprising that a majority of the panel would share his views. Judge, another question. Proponents of research argue that abortion is legal, therefore research should be permitted. The NIH policy under discussion is a moratorium on federal funding, and I emphasize funding, of fetal transplants from abortions. Therefore, shouldn't we look for guidance to the federal government's policy on funding of abortions?
We should look for guidance to the government. I agree with that statement.
Well, the reason I mention that is that we have an amendment, we have a policy, it's referred to as a Hyde Amendment, which
Yes.
says we don't fund abortions. And so it's not surprising then that Dr. Sullivan and Dr. Mason would take that into consideration in making that decision, don't you think?
Not surprising to me, no.
Okay. Father Burchell, how do you discount the recommendations of the NIH panel, which by a large majority recommended that HHS lift the moratorium on fetal tissue harvesting?
Well, our panel operated under something of a shadow, Mr. Bliley. The Assistant Secretary for Health had instructed the director of the NIH to appoint an advisory committee or committees. Instead of that, the director assembled a research panel, which is not the same thing, and the NIH intended to treat the panel as a gathering of individual consultants and thus to hold our meetings in secret. It was only when threat of a lawsuit intervened that the NIH changed its original intention and opened our hearings to the public. We were assigned at the beginning 1 working day to draft, adopt, and submit our views on this entire subject after 2 days of hearings. It was only at the request of our distinguished chairman that further meeting time was allowed. And it was only after the submission of our detailed dissent that a further request was made for yet a 3rd meeting. Of the 21 members, 17 of whom, if I may correct the record, accepted the report and 4 of whom rejected it, a large proportion were already beneficiaries of the NIH. A large number of the members of the panel were already on published record as acquiescent on the ethical issue of abortion. There was no surprise whatsoever in the final vote of the panel. When we submitted our report to the standing advisory committee to the chairman, which had set aside the entirety of a day and a half's working time to consider and deliberate upon our report, that committee took less than 1/2 hour to decide, after virtually no questioning of us who were present, to decide to accept the report, and less than another 1/2 hour to decide not to deliberate upon any feature of it and to go home. Under those conditions, it would not be surprising that some would consider our proceedings to have been foreordained.
Thank you, Father. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Bliley. This is an interesting point that's being brought here, and I want the 3 members of the panel who were in the majority to be able to respond, although I didn't want to spend my time on this question. I thought, let me just ask Reverend Burchell, do you think that the Secretary of HHS disregarded this panel's recommendation because he didn't think it was fairly handled in the deliberations, or because he agreed with your position and not theirs?
I'm in no position to speculate on the Secretary's motives.
But you think that this commission was unfairly constituted and didn't handle itself properly in terms of the opportunity for all points of view. Judge Adams, Dr. Ryan, Dr. Walters.
May I correct that? I simply said that I reported facts which had given rise in other people's minds to questions about the work of the panel.
The conclusion that one can draw from your statement of facts would be that in some way, because this panel reached its decision, that its decision is tainted because it didn't follow appropriate procedure, and furthermore, that the members of the panel were appointed by Dr. Weingarten and asked to come on this panel in order to get a result, and in order to come with a pre-advanced notion of what they thought the conclusion ought to be, and therefore to deliver that. Judge Adams, why don't you respond to that?
Since I was present when most of the members were selected, I think that that would be a bad impression to create.
Did you or any member of your commission come with your mind made up with coaching from the NIH director?
No, Dr. Weingarten never told me. I was surprised to hear that his views were as somebody expressed them today. I didn't know what his views were.
I didn't know his views to be that either.
But in selecting the members of the panel, I had something to do with it because he would run the names by me and some of the other people. And the only thing I insisted on, and I think I got, was that the members of the panel all be qualified and distinguished citizens and distinguished in their various callings. The decision to have the hearings open, I believe I made. I recall either Dr. Weingarten or Dr. Moskowitz calling me one day and saying, how should these proceedings be held? And I said, well, that's not even a question. They must be open at all times. And I don't believe that we cut off any discussion. That's my recollection, but since I'm the chairman, maybe I'm not the right person to respond to that. I don't recall cutting off discussion.
Yeah. Dr. Ryan?
Yes, may I respond to that? With all due respect to Reverend Burchell, he wasn't asked who called him up. I would surmise it was someone similar to the person that called us up. And they were, in fact, someone that was responding to lists that were prepared by the President's office and by others. As you know, they don't form a moral panel anymore without counting up what an individual's religion is or what they think they believe. The idea now, in retrospect, that this was a fixed panel is offensive to me. I think that most people went there with goodwill. You would be surprised the number of people, for instance, who individuals thought believed one way or another and voted differently based on the hearings. It was never, to my knowledge, ever suggested that our hearings would be in secret. Under the Sunshine Law, it would be impossible to hold such hearings in secret and would be counterproductive. Everything was done in public, and all of the people that wanted to testify on both sides of the issue were brought to it. So I think that if you can say anything you want about the committee report, but to say that it was a stacked panel is unfair and uncalled for.
Dr. Walters, just very briefly, because we're being diverted from the substantive question, which is really the heart of the issue.
Yes.
But I think you,
I certainly concur with Dr. Ryan that the majority of panel members went into this investigation with open minds and attempt to listen as carefully as they could to the best evidence and the best arguments and reach their own conclusions. Furthermore, we shouldn't look only at this panel. We ought to look at this whole series of panels internationally who have each taken a fresh look at this, and all of them have come out at exactly the same point that the majority of this panel did.
Reverend Burchell, who called you to serve on this panel?
My recollection, Mr. Chairman, is that a staff member of Dr. J. Moskowitz contacted me.
And do you know whether you were recommended by any group that had a point of view to have you serve on this panel?
I may have been recommended by several groups. I have published on the subject.
Do you think you were recommended by groups that were opposed to abortion?
I may well have been.
Okay. Let me just indicate that Dr. Weingarten was the first person to request that this issue be reviewed by the panel, and if he just wanted to do fetal transplant research, it seems to me strange to think that he would ask for a review by a panel as opposed to just going ahead and having the research take place itself. Mr. Bliley?
No further questions, Mr. Chairman.
Okay, then I'm going to recognize myself for another round. Because I do want to get to the question. Reverend Burchell, do you think that if someone disagrees with your point of view, that they don't do so with some sense of legitimacy and concern, as well as some ethical point of view that just may be different than yours?
I work in a number of fields in ethics, Mr. Chairman, which are highly controverted. And I tried to impose upon myself the restraint many years ago to deal with what people said rather than their reasons for saying so. And I think I brought that attitude to this panel.
It didn't seem to me you brought that attitude in evaluating this panel to us. It sounded to me like you said this panel came up with this overwhelming conclusion with which you disagreed because it was tainted by the selection of the personnel and the procedure.
Mr. Chairman, if I may
Am I
reassert
wrong?
my correction. Yes, sir.
Okay. Correct me.
I adduced a number of facts which I am prepared to sustain if later required, from which, as you said, one might indeed infer that there was a shadow over our proceedings. I offered the facts, you rendered the inference.
Why did you offer the facts? What relevance were they to the question of what the policy ought to be?
They are rather well known, and I think that they are very significant to the credibility of a federal panel.
Do you believe that that one could reach the conclusion, based on the existing data, that by and large women to this point have not sought abortions in order to encourage research, but have sought abortions for other reasons?
Hitherto?
Hitherto.
Yes, I would in this country. That is my experience, and that is, I know of no findings otherwise.
And since there are no findings otherwise, you've made an assumption that from here on out, women will be more likely to seek abortions because they will have heard that in getting an abortion they can be doing some good for other people.
From the evidence submitted to us at our hearings and in our deliberations, there were good grounds offered for expecting that this motivation would, if the federal government had given the implicit approval of its sponsorship to this research program, that this would form a significant motivation among the many reasons which women in this situation cope with.
How about a fetal tissue that was not voluntarily aborted? Do you think that would be appropriate to use that tissue for transplantation purposes?
Subject to correction from my colleagues, my understanding is that no member of our panel expressed any ethical misgivings about the use of fetal tissue which was derived from spontaneous abortion or trauma, or from cell lines derived therefrom.
I'm sorry, I didn't understand. You said you would not object to research.
I don't think any member of the panel did or would, and I certainly do not.
How about using a fetal tissue from a fetus that was being aborted because of the source of the pregnancy being rape?
That is an elective or induced abortion, and it is, I think, very different than a miscarriage in that whatever the burdens that the pregnancy and birth impose upon the parents and others, it is still a decision to destroy an innocent child.
Judge Adams, you stated you personally don't think abortions ought to take place for the most part. Why wouldn't you decide, and the majority, why didn't the majority decide that if there's an elected abortion procedure that took place, that that fetal tissue shouldn't be permitted to be used?
We didn't address that because that wasn't one of Dr. Wyndham's 10 questions, but I think Dr. Burchell is correct that the spontaneous abortion would have probably have gotten the approval unanimously of the panel.
But I'm not talking about spontaneous. I'm talking about an elected abortion procedure. It's legal.
Yes.
Someone may decide to do it, and Reverend Burchell may not agree with it, and others may not agree with it, given their own moral point of view. But abortion is a legal procedure, and there has already been a decision to have an abortion, and that fetal tissue is otherwise going to be buried. And the life of a human being not saved or enhanced just because it's going to be buried. What, do you think that that should be the proper course to take when there was an elected procedure, as opposed to a spontaneous procedure?
I think I voted that given proper guidelines by NIH and proper constraints that I am willing to vote with that process.
Yes, Dr. Ryan and Dr. Walters both to respond to this issue.
Yeah, I should point out that everyone talks about abortion being legal. There are a lot of people in this country who feel that it's morally permissible to do an abortion. I don't know what the number is, but it's a vast number. And
Majority, I think.
And I don't know, sir, but in a democratic society, I think we ought to respect one another's views on that in that regard. And I personally do believe that if the abortion procedure is separated from the use to which the tissue is to be put, I disagree with Robertson, who was a minority person in that regard. I disagree with him. I believe it's morally acceptable to do that. If the two procedures are separated, and they should be separated to protect the pregnant woman.
Dr. Walters.
I think that the use of fetal tissue for either research or therapeutic purposes is exactly analogous to the use of cadaver tissue in any other circumstance. The goal of the safeguards, the goal of separating abortion from the decision about donation, is simply to take account of the fact that abortion is a very special decision.
You wouldn't distinguish the idea of saying that there couldn't be an organ transplant from a human that had been murdered?
We simply don't inquire into the cause of death of someone who has recently died, whose body contains organs that could be useful to others.
Well, I want to thank all of you for your presentation to us. We have other witnesses we want to hear from, but we appreciate your being here, the work you've done on this panel, and wrestling with this issue, which is complex both medically and ethically, and giving us the benefit of your views. Thank you very much. Our next witness is Dr. James Mason, who is testifying on behalf of the administration. Dr. Mason is Assistant Secretary for Health in the Department of Health and Human Services. As Assistant Secretary, Dr. Mason made the decision to continue the ban on fetal tissue transplantation research indefinitely. That decision was subsequently ratified by Secretary Sullivan. Dr. Mason, thank you for joining us today. Your prepared statement will be made part of the record in full. We'd like to ask you, if you would, to limit your oral presentation to us to 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I'm pleased to be here to discuss the moratorium on the use of federal funds for fetal tissue transplantation research. Human fetal tissue has been used in biomedical research for many years. More recently, researchers have explored transplantation of fetal tissue in patients with Parkinson's disease, diabetes, and Alzheimer's. It is this transplantation of human fetal tissue from induced abortions, as distinguished from other fetal tissue research, which is the subject of the moratorium. As we have heard this morning, the moratorium was initially established by the former Assistant Secretary for Health on March 22, 1988, and it was he who directed the NIH to convene a special advisory panel. Additional information on the sequence of events leading up to the decision by the Secretary to extend the moratorium is contained in my full statement. After completing our review of the relevant materials, including the report of the Transplantation Research Panel, and consulting with senior officials within the department and the administration, the Secretary and I reached a number of conclusions. Both the administration and Congress have made it clear that this department in particular should not be funding activities which encourage or promote abortion. We are persuaded that one must accept the likelihood that permitting the human fetal tissue research at issue will increase the incidence of abortion. We are particularly convinced by those who point out that most women arrive at the abortion decision after much soul-searching and uncertainty. Providing the additional rationalization of directly advancing the cause of human therapeutics cannot help but tilt some already vulnerable women toward a decision to have an abortion. The proponents of fetal tissue transplantation research acknowledge that a strict wall would have to be erected between the abortion decision and the decision to donate fetal tissue to research. While such a distinction may be easy to theorize, we doubt that such a neat separation can be accomplished. For example, because there is often a need to utilize postmortem tissue promptly, it may be necessary to consult pregnant women before the abortion is actually performed. This will potentially influence the decision-making process despite the safeguards recommended by the NIH advisory panel. In addition, should the research efforts in question prove successful, a greater need for aborted fetuses could result. For these reasons, we believe that a decision to lift the moratorium would be inconsistent with the administration and congressional imperatives mentioned earlier. Accordingly, after consideration of the report of the NIH Fetal Tissue Transplant Research Panel, the proceedings attendant to its development, and other statutory and ethical considerations, the Secretary concluded to continue the moratorium indefinitely. After reviewing this matter with the Office of General Counsel and the Department of Justice, we are satisfied that there is no statutory mandate requiring departmental support of such research. We recognize the potential benefits in biomedical knowledge to be gained from continuing human fetal tissue transplantation research. Interest in continuing such research continues in the private sector. The department, through the NIH, has a long-standing commitment to sponsoring innovative research approaches to diabetes, Parkinson's, and other diseases. Many different avenues are being explored to prevent, treat, and cure these disabling conditions. In my testimony, I give examples of what's happening with regard to Parkinson's and Alzheimer's, with regard to some promising avenues. The same is true for diabetes. Extending the moratorium was not an easy decision. The Secretary and I are staunch supporters of biomedical research. In the case of fetal tissue transplantation research, however, these research objectives conflict with administration policy that seeks to ensure the protection of all human life. This concludes my remarks, and I'll now be pleased to answer any questions you may have.
Thank you very much, Dr. Mason. You're the one who actually made the decision as the Assistant Secretary for Health to reject the recommendations of the panel and to recommend to the Secretary that he keep this ban on fetal transplantation research in effect indefinitely. You said you can't separate the morality of abortion from the morality of doing research on the dead fetal tissue after abortion. I can make a distinction without difficulty. So did the Adams Committee and the NIH Directors Advisory Committee. But I cannot separate the morality of banning this research from the morality of continuing suffering and death from diseases that might be cured. Are you saying that the morality of abortion is more important than the morality of preventing disability and death?
In responding to your question, let me say that there is a process of recommendations, and that Secretary Sullivan made the decision. I made the recommendation to the Secretary, and I just wanted to straighten that out. The ultimate power for making this kind of a decision is inherent to the responsibility of the Secretary.
Well, we invited the Secretary to testify today, and he just turned us down and said under no circumstances on any date would he appear. So you've been sent by the department, and it was your recommendation to him.
It was indeed my recommendation.
So you came to a conclusion, so I'm searching your conclusion.
Good.
My question to you is, did you decide that the morality of this abortion question is more important than the morality of preventing disability and death?
I think this is an excellent question, Mr. Chairman. What about relieving human suffering? And I want to say that the Secretary and I are deeply sympathetic to these people who suffer from Parkinson's disease and diabetes. We're sympathetic to the feelings and concerns of parents and other family members. But science is never carried out in an ethical or moral vacuum. There are areas where federal funding and support is inappropriate. Who speaks, for example, for fetal life?
I understand that there's no absolute question, but I'm asking about the comparison, the evaluation, the weighing of moral questions. There's a moral question about abortion. There's also a moral question about saving lives when lives can be saved by using a fetal tissue that's otherwise going to be dumped someplace, buried under the ground, lost. You're not going to bring that fetal tissue back to life, and you're weighing these different moral questions. What I want to know is, did you discard one as opposed to the other?
Well, I guess I can't regard fetal tissue as just garbage. I think there's a sanctity for fetal life, for human life, and a practice.
How about a dead human being? A dead human being that's now brain damaged, and there's going to be an organ taken from that dead human being. There's a sanctity in that human being, but we certainly would permit, and I don't think you would object, on any ethical grounds, to taking an organ from a person who's dead and allowing that organ to give the gift of life to someone else.
No, I would not, but I still think this is not just garbage. And I don't believe that a practice which to succeed must have a continuous supply of aborted fetuses is one that this nation wants or needs. We must find other ways that do not require the destruction of one or more fetal lives in order to relieve the suffering of one person with Parkinson's disease or diabetes.
Are we requiring that there be more abortions in order to have research done with fetal tissue?
There's no question in my mind that when a woman who is confronted with the most difficult soul-searching decision, and here on this scale, to destroy this fetus, and then you put on the scale that she, in doing so, may benefit other human life, I think that can tilt that scale toward abortion. I'm convinced that not just fetal research, that's been going on for years, but this powerful inducement of being able to assist a person with diabetes or Parkinson's can indeed influence all of the complexities, notwithstanding the decision whether to have the abortion or not to have that abortion.
The Adams Committee had that charge to them to evaluate whether there was going to be an inducement, an increase in abortion as a result of the research that may take place. They said it was highly unlikely. They voted 19 to 1 or 18 to 3. It wasn't even a close vote. They said that they didn't think this was going to take place, and they looked at studies on that question. Why do you think that more women will have abortions? You said the reason why you thought more women have, because they would come to this decision. But do you have any studies on this that you didn't share with Judge Adams? And have you met with any abortion counselors who have told you this? Or have you met with any pregnant women to see what their views on the subject? They came to a different conclusion after looking at all the data and evidence. You have come to a conclusion based on belief. I want to know what data you've seen that leads you to this belief.
Well, you're talking about belief, and yet you just said that the panel said they didn't think that there would be any more abortions. They don't know, and I don't know either. But
they had some data. They looked at all the abortions that have taken place, and they didn't find that there is any appreciable number of abortions that have taken place in this country in order to encourage fetal research. They didn't see any evidence up to this point. They looked at the question and evaluated it and talked to different people. Who did you talk to? Did you talk to any of the counselors that deal with women who are struggling with that abortion decision?
Mr. Chairman, I heard the testimonies. They're comparing fetal research with fetal tissue transplantation, and I think they're not in the same ballpark in terms of the magnitude of the potential inducement. One is research, and that doesn't do a lot of inducing. But when a woman knows that she might be able to give that aborted fetus to the beneficial application of diabetes and Parkinson's, we haven't had any experience in that area.
Did you talk to any pregnant women to see what their views would be as they weigh this?
I have not personally talked to any.
Did you talk to any counselors of pregnant women who are weighing
I have talked to counselors of pregnant women.
Did you give us the names of those counselors who advised you on that question? We do have research now sponsored by the federal government that supported other forms of fetal tissue research in cancer, vaccines, developmental and childhood medicine for over 30 years. Do you have any evidence at all or any data that this has resulted in increased abortion?
No, that's what I've been trying to explain, Mr. Chairman, that we've been doing fetal tissue research for 30 years. But this powerful inducement called fetal tissue transplantation with potential beneficial therapeutic effects is a new ballgame, and we've had no experience in that particular area. It's too new. And can you imagine if fetal tissue transplantation proves to be successful, and that's hyped in the media, the powerful inducement this becomes to a woman who's caught in that dilemma as to whether or not to have an abortion, and then she knows on this side that it may have a beneficial effect for some other person. We have no past history with that. And I think it's important, before we start down a long road, to recognize where it may take us. I don't think we should just go blithely down the road and then suddenly find that we've created a major moral and ethical dilemma.
But we can anticipate questions. We can anticipate that a woman might decide to have her fetal tissue donated to a particular friend or family member, and we can stop that. We can anticipate that there could be an economic market and that women may abort the fetus in order to sell it, and we can ban that and prohibit it. We can try to anticipate what we can deal with now and try to deal with it, and we can continue to monitor it. But from the very start now, for fear that we're going to have success, you would stop us from doing that research. And the research is going to take place anyway. They're doing it in other countries. They're going to do it in the private sector. The only ones who are not going to be able to do the research are the people who are involved with the National Institutes of Health. What are you going to do then when they find some successes and we don't even have any of these moral guidelines, these restrictions in place in order to deal with the problem as it arises, if it does arise?
Well, Mr. Chairman, we're not talking about legality because obviously fetal tissue transplantation is legal. But that doesn't mean that the federal government should be funding everything that turns out to be legal. There are ethical considerations as well. We don't use federal funds to promote or encourage abortion. And we do not feel that we should turn around and use federal funds to promote and encourage abortion as a result of fetal tissue transplantation research.
You're worried about the success of transplantation research, and therefore you want to stop it before it begins. That doesn't mean there's not going to be research in this area. And it doesn't mean that we're not going to have success. It means the success may be delayed a long period of time, but others are going to do this research, and at some point, if the fetal transplant is successful in saving lives, we're going to have to deal with these questions. Why don't we deal with them? Why make the decision to say to people now who might be helped by a transplant and that you're going to have to go without that, and find that maybe 10 years from now or 20 years from now, the people who are in similar circumstances will have that transplant available to them because of research done not by NIH but others?
I didn't want to imply that I'm not worried about inducing abortions now. I can only see this growing larger if fetal tissue transplantation is successful. But even right now, in the context of research, I believe that this will have a stimulating, inducing, encouraging role to play in terms of a woman's decision as to whether or not to have an abortion here and now.
You have that belief. I'd like to know what data you have to justify that conclusion.
I'd like to know what data anyone has that feels contrary to that.
Well, the Adams Commission had data, and they did an evaluation, and they talked to people, and they looked at the questions of what issues went into decisions of abortions. They talked to counselors. They were charged with looking at this issue, and Judge Adams himself and others of the commission as well share your view on abortion, so they weren't disinterested in that question. But they had data, and they evaluated. What data did you have?
Well, the data they had was that this was a serious problem, and that some wall would have to be erected between a woman's decision to have an abortion and to use that fetus for fetal transplantation research. And where the difference is I don't think that wall can be built. I don't think that wall can exist, and it's a great wall in theory, but in practice, I don't believe the wall will exist out there in the nation's abortion clinics.
Did you look at the experience in Sweden, where they are already doing this kind of research, and they have no data showing no increase in the number of abortions? This was one of the areas that the Adams Commission looked at and helped them reach their decision.
Mr. Chairman, I don't believe you could tell if there was a 1%, a 3%, a 5% increase. I doubt very much that the Swedish data would be able to even pick that kind of thing up. We're not talking about a 100% increase, a doubling of abortions. We're talking about a number of abortions that will come about as a result of this powerful inducement.
There's no way for you to know the answer to this question, so you are making a guess that there are going to be some encouraged abortions and deciding based on that guess that there are going to be many people with Parkinson's disease and diabetes and epilepsy and different genetic diseases that will have to suffer and not be able to have the benefit of some of the therapy and, in fact, cures for their maladies.
Well, I think you're way down to the end of my road already, because you've heard testimony here this morning of the problems and difficulties that would come in terms of treating hundreds or thousands with diabetes or Parkinson's disease. So I think you've simply strengthened my conviction that you have to look here and now, and you also have to look down the road. And either place you look, you see fetal tissue transplantation as a powerful inducement to a woman who's going through that agonizing consideration as to whether or not she should abort her baby.
We do have this other fetal research activities going on, which we've had for 30 years. Your ban does not address any of these other areas of fetal tissue research. Why is that, and how do you justify banning transplant research alone? And what do you say to the Parkinson's patients who think that you're treating cancer patients more fairly?
Mr. Chairman, a number of people have favored extending the moratorium to include all fetal research. We rejected that for a number of reasons. First of all, in the context of quantification of inducement for abortion. The direct benefits another human might receive from fetal tissue transplantation, as I've already said, would tip the scale to a decision already the result of deep soul searching. The inducement here is high. It's like a organ transplant. Inducement is much higher than donating a cadaver to a medical school for dissection. General research is not as glitzy as direct therapeutic effect upon another human being. So number one is quantification of inducement for abortion. The second, and just as important, is the concept of tissue requirements. For polio, for example, all of the poliomyelitis research and therapeutics were carried out on stable cell lines derived from less than 3 fetuses. In other words, whether the fetus was derived from a spontaneous abortion or however you started with the first fetus, you didn't have to go back and for each step or for each therapeutic result go back and derive further fetal tissue because it was a stable cell line. While with human fetal tissue transplantation from induced abortions, it's right now, with regard to Parkinson's disease, they had to use the tissue from, 2 to 4 fetuses for one patient. And each time you have to go back to a fresh supply of fetal tissue. So inducement and the quantification of the supply were both powerful reasons in our deciding that we should continue and to support fetal tissue research, and the moratorium should be at that area where the concept of direct benefit to others tips the scale in the direction of being a powerful inducement to abortions.
Dr. Mason, both the Parkinson and diabetes projects at NIH went through the usual process, were peer-reviewed, had sufficiently high scientific ratings that they could be funded even with very limited dollars. Isn't that correct?
That's correct.
Can you name other types of research that have been peer-reviewed and recommended and funded that you have banned?
Not right off, I couldn't.
Will you be funding any fetal tissue transplantation research now? And if such a project went through the NIH process and were peer-reviewed and rated to be the best application received all year, does the NIH have direction to fund it?
The moratorium would prohibit funding that research.
So they don't have discretion.
They don't have
They're
discretion.
stopped in their tracks. Would a researcher in this situation be able to appeal this decision of NIH?
At the present time, the moratorium has been extended indefinitely. So the answer is no.
What does that mean, indefinitely?
Well,
what if it's a terrific project and they could make a case to you? Do they have the opportunity to come to you? Are you the one they come to?
I believe in management by exception. I think we'd be willing to take a look at anything, but I would say it would have to be something very, very different from the usual concept of fetal tissue transplantation research.
Now, what does it mean to have a ban on this research indefinitely?
I think that's as much a legal term as anything else. In putting the moratorium into effect, I believe that there was a search. Permanent means that there would never be any consideration to look at it again, while indefinitely probably has a little narrower view that at some point in time new information could be made available, which would allow one to take a look at it. But I don't see that essentially there is a major difference between the two. Maybe slightly narrower in the indefinitely.
Well, the word indefinite implies you might change your position. What information would you need to change your position, and are you seeking any such information?
The moratorium is based upon, as I've said, the concern that this would be a powerful inducement to women to have an abortion. We would have to be totally convinced that this were not the case, and I would have to say that I think getting that kind of information that would reassure us would be very, very difficult to get, because you would be talking to women. You couldn't talk to women in general. It would have to be women going through the very process of determining, of considering, of soul-searching whether they wanted to have an abortion. And these are not usually the kind of people that you study. And I think the subtleties of weighing this, one side of the scale versus the others, are so complex that I see it's very difficult to get a study that would tell you one way or another.
Well, you could look at information from other countries that allow fetal transplantation, and that data could be valid.
I'm not sure at what we could do that. You're right. I'm a little concerned about the level of sensitivity. If one were concerned about one additional abortion as a result of that inducement, I don't think you could pick that up. At some point above that, and at what point, I'm not sure you might be able to.
Well, you don't see any data then coming about to give you the conclusion that would allow you to change your mind. So this isn't just an indefinite ban, it's a permanent ban, isn't it?
Mr. Chairman, seeing the short-term now and the long-term effects, I don't see a change in that moratorium.
Okay. You said that the word indefinite was a legal term. Both your own legal counsel and the lawyers at the Department of Justice advised you that formal rulemaking was preferable to the informal and unreviewed ban that was issued. In fact, your legal counsel described this approach as having a, quote, shaky legal basis, end quote. Why didn't you go through the formal rulemaking as you do with most other important decisions at the Public Health Service?
Well, we felt that the issue had already been extensively considered through public proceedings at NIH with regard to the panel. As part of these procedures, there had been opportunity for public input on all sides of the issue, and further opportunity for public comment would have been superfluous and would have just resulted in added delay. Hence, we were advised that it would be legally supportable for us to simply issue a decision memorandum, and we decided to adopt that approach.
Even if this informal way you've handled this is possibly legally supportable or defensible, it still isn't the preferable one or the routine one for such decisions. I'm not asking if you were acting legally. I'm asking you why you chose a process that your lawyers said was not the preferable one.
In consultation with General Counsel and Department of Justice, this was felt to be a legal and reasonable way to put the moratorium into effect.
You've been Director of CDC, Acting Secretary for Health, and Assistant Secretary for Health. You've been in one office or the other for many years now. Leaving aside the budgeting and financial decisions that you make, Have you ever rejected a unanimous advisory committee report from an agency before in any other area, NIH, FDA, CDC?
This wasn't unanimous, but I have never rejected a unanimous...
The advisory committee was unanimous.
Okay. No, I have not. That doesn't mean that that I didn't or that I wouldn't in the future, where I had strong feelings about the recommendation, as we did in this case.
Mm-hmm. And do you know whether Dr. Sullivan, although he's been in office for much less time, has ever rejected a unanimous advisory committee report on anything?
I don't know.
Let me go to the heart of your question of this wall that you think cannot be erected between what caused the death or the reasons for the death and the transplantation of the result that's left after that death has occurred. Suppose a man or woman committed suicide. Do you think that we ought to be able to transplant any of the organs from that individual to another individual whose life could be saved?
I think one can look at suicide and whether organs should be used in the light of two approaches. First of all, I believe that when a person chooses to take his or her own life, that individual is probably sick, depressed, or has other mental illness, and so I would look upon a death due to suicide in that context as any other disease that resulted in death. On the other hand, if you looked at it as not being a disease and that someone decided of their own free will to commit suicide, then at least there was informed consent and the person did themselves in that context. I would prefer to look upon this as a disease, but in either way, I would see the person committing suicide to have voluntarily decided to do that.
Seems to me suicide can be a perfectly rational decision by someone who's not ill in any way, given the life circumstances under which they live, even though you or I might decide on a religious basis that it's not morally permissible.
Yeah, I'll accept that, but it can be but it is also a decision that the individual made.
Suppose the individual decided, with all the other circumstances in that person's life and all the difficulties he or she had to undertake, that at least with a suicide, the organ would go to save someone else's life. Do you think that possible inducement of more suicides should be a basis for deciding that we ought not to use transplanted organs from people who elected to take their lives?
I think if we had an epidemic in a high school or a college of suicides that we felt were clearly motivated by a desire to provide organs or tissues, I think society would sit back and say, should we put some restrictions on that?
You would wait till the data came in. You would wait to see whether that in fact was taking place, wouldn't you?
Oh, here you would find a suicide note saying I committed suicide because I wanted my, or you might induce that one way or another, but if that were to occur, I think society would put restrictions around this.
Mm-hmm. You wouldn't stop it in advance, though, and for fear that this may take place?
No, I wouldn't do it in advance.
A woman's trying to decide whether to carry a fetus to term or not. She's got to be weighing a lot of considerations. Let's say the primary consideration was that this pregnancy was a result of a rape. But she, from a religious point of view, had always been against abortion, but couldn't bear the idea of carrying this baby to term. Weighed the issue, and one of the considerations was that at least the fetus, the tissue of that fetus, can be used to save another life. Is that an improper decision on her part?
I believe it is. It is an improper decision because in the case of the suicide victim, at least they had given their consent and were doing this of their own free will, but that's not the case in terms of the fetus. There's no informed consent here, and no one is speaking for the fetus.
So your issue isn't that more women are going to decide to have abortions. The issue is that you don't think that the abortions ought to take place because the fetus is not deciding to be aborted. It's the mother that's deciding to abort the fetus.
Oh, you brought this up in the context of abortion, and that's why I was referring it to this, that I would find that suicide to give tissue or organs is improper, and I would think any destruction of fetal life purely for that reason would also be improper. But that's not what we're really dealing with. The panel decided that there was worry, there were concerns about this inducement, and they said that a wall should be built. And the real issue between Secretary Sullivan, myself, and the panel is whether or not that wall can be built. It isn't that we differ significantly from the panel in terms of our concern that that inducement is there. The pure and simple is whether you can put that wall in place and whether you can keep it in place in the abortion clinics throughout the United States of America.
The Adams panel didn't disregard the fear that there may be more abortions as a result of the possibility of fetal tissue transplant. They didn't just say we're going to ignore whatever reasons went into the decision to have the abortion. They said that they did not want to encourage anymore, and they looked at possibilities. A woman decided, let's say, to have an abortion so the tissue could be transplanted for a relative who had Parkinson's disease or a dear friend who had diabetes, and they said that should be stopped. Now that's not just saying we're not going to look at the reasons for the abortion. They said we could see that that could be a possibility, let's stop it. They looked at the possibility of a woman deciding in the future, if there were a commercial market to have an abortion, and they said there should not be any permitted sale. And they looked at what they thought may well be reasons for more elected decisions for abortion and tried to deal with those. And then Judge Adams said, and he still didn't know the answer, but he thought there ought to be periodic review. You've decided you know the answer in advance and won't permit any research to go forward from this day on because you've made assumptions and you've decided this wall cannot exist, and you've prejudged the issue. And in prejudging the issue based on the morality of what you see as the question as it pertains to abortion, I believe you've ignored the moral question of saving the lives of people whose lives can be saved from these dreaded diseases.
Well, I disagree with you. I think they talked about no commercialization, no designation, which we agree totally with. Then let's try to build a wall and hope that the wall can be built and that it can be maintained, and then let's review this. We feel that the wall can't be built, and so why say it can be built and then come back and perhaps find out later, if you can even measure it, whether the wall really deterred the powerful influence of helping another person. We do have a wall that we say exists now for organ transplants for others. We also have this wall that we assume is there for fetuses in terms of other kind of research. We do have models of this wall existing and guiding us in our permitting research to go forward, and in fact not just research but transplants themselves to go forward to save lives. Why can't we use the existing models that we know about and assume that unless we learn otherwise that those models are valid? Well, here's where you and I totally agree then, because those walls that currently exist are built around the concept of informed consent, due process, and all of those measures that protect all of the individuals involved. And we don't build that we put a wall hoping that we can separate the decision of the mother to have an abortion from the fetal tissue transplantation issue, but we haven't backed into all of the other powerful protections that exist in other transplantation areas, such as informed consent and due process. So I think if you could build that in, then we'd be in pretty good shape on the fetal tissue transplantation
Well, the Adams Committee did talk about informed consent and some of these other safeguards. But let's look at it from another point of view. Spontaneous aborted fetuses, you don't have any objection to having
No
those?
objections at all.
Okay. How about where the decision was made that did not involve knowing that the fetus was going to be used for transplant?
The moratorium is against induced abortion.
But we know a woman decided to elect an abortion for other reasons. Why can't we permit lives to be saved with the fetuses from those abortions?
How would we know whether the beneficial effects to someone else? If you could
a woman who
theoretically,
is pregnant because of a rape and who believes that abortion is perfectly permissible and moral, and you know this woman believes that, and she writes it out and spells it out, why can't we use that fetus? Why can't we use the tissue from that fetus to save the life of somebody who has Parkinson's disease or diabetes?
if you can separate the inducement of benefit in another human life, then we probably could, if you can do that.
Well, it seems to me that if we're trying to balance the moralities, not trying to induce abortions, which is a view that is stronger with you because you have this objection to abortion than some of the others of us who think it's not per se an objectionable procedure, versus the morality of trying to save lives. Why can't we try to draw another line to balance it out differently? Have you thought that perhaps maybe you can revisit this issue and look at that possibility?
Our minds are always open to looking at those kind of issues. I think it'll be difficult, but we'll at least give it some thought.
Mm-hmm. Do you think that the Adams Commission didn't give it some thought?
That's a very difficult question.
Do you think, by the way, do you think the members of the Adams Commission were put on that commission in order to get this result?
I in no way want to issue any judgment. I don't know the background of putting them on, and I have to assume that the process was totally appropriate and reasoable.
You knew Dr. Weingarten and worked closely with him. Did you know that he in any way wanted to prejudge this issue in selecting members of this panel?
I don't believe that Dr. Weingarten is the kind of person that would set up a panel or clinic to get an answer that he wanted.
Do you know whether Dr. Weingarten was urged by members of Congress who were against abortion to select different people to be on this panel because of their views on that issue?
I have no knowledge of that background.
Dr. Mason, I appreciate very much your being here. This is a difficult issue, and we're trying to sort through this issue because I fear that that while there are political pressures and moral pressures that we have to try to balance this out as best we can. And obviously I disagree with the conclusion you reached.
Thank you
very much. Our third panel comprises representatives of various health and medical organizations whose membership may benefit from fetal tissue transplantation research. Mr. J. Richard Monroe is president of the Juvenile Diabetes Foundation International. Representing the American Parkinson's Disease Association is Mrs. Ava Crowder from Lubbock, Texas. Dr. Antoinette Eaton is vice president of the American Academy of Pediatrics, and testifying on behalf of the American Paralysis Association is Mrs. Karen Colvin. And finally, we will be hearing from Trudy and Howard Jacobson, who are appearing today on behalf of the Epilepsy Foundation of America. I'd like to ask these people to come forward. I want to thank each of you for coming today to this hearing and being willing to give us your views on this question. Unlike Dr. Mason, who is a regular testifying before our subcommittee, I know that many of you have come for the very first time to testify, first of all, let me suggest you relax. We just want to hear your views. We have some questions. Other members may come in and ask questions as well. But it's only through hearing a whole range of views and learning from people who have a direct interest and knowledge, understanding of these matters, do we really get the benefit of all that we need to know and trying to make the right decision. So I thank you for coming. The way we handle these, the procedure is that some of you have prepared a statement in writing, and that whole statement will be in the record. And at the end of this hearing, we'll have a transcript of this whole proceedings, and that whole statement, every way you wanted to say it, you wrote it down, will be in the record. We'd like to ask you to limit your oral presentation to us to no more than 5 minutes, even if you're just reading from the statement. However you want to do it, that's up to you, but we do have to limit it to around 5 minutes so we can just get everybody in and an opportunity to be heard and a full time for answers and questions. Mr. Monroe, why don't we start with you?
Good morning, Mr. Chairman. My name is Dick Monroe, and I'm here in my capacity as the president of the Juvenile Diabetes Foundation International. I appear before you as the father of 2 sons with diabetes. My son Doug, who is 21, was diagnosed at the age of 10. My son Mac, who is now 18, was diagnosed at the age of 13. They have learned to live every day of their lives with the insulin syringe and the swab. But neither the diabetic nor his family can learn to live with the prospect of dramatically shortened lifespan and the myriad of potential complications that my sons face: blindness, heart disease, stroke, neurological disorders, and kidney failure. My sons are only 2 of the 12 million diabetics in this country. I implore you to utilize your legislative powers to correct an unconscionable wrong that threatens to halt in both the public and private sectors the progress of pancreatic transplantation research. Research which may literally save the lives of my sons and millions of victims of diabetes. We simply cannot continue to accept the claim of the anti-abortion movement that the use and research of fetal tissue derived from induced abortion has any relevance whatsoever to the debate about abortion. This research is not about abortion, it's about responsibility. Responsibility to use tissue which embodies the promise of a cure for some of the most dreaded diseases of our times. Responsibility not to dispose of tissue which exists and will continue to exist as long as abortion is legal. Responsibility to ensure that public policy is formulated with appropriate regard to due process. I'm appalled that the administration arbitrarily decreed the current fetal tissue moratorium in internal memorandum rather than through a rulemaking process which would have provided public comment. What we are discussing here today is hope. The hope of JDF and its supporters that insulin-dependent diabetics can be cured by the implantation of normal insulin-producing cells. We already know that transplants into rodents of these cells arrest the progression of insulin-dependent diabetes. The biomedical research community believes that it is time to pursue clinical trials involving transplants into humans. Researchers are optimistic that the special properties of fetal tissue will facilitate the success of these transplants. For instance, many researchers believe that the host is less likely to reject fetal tissue than adult tissue, and that fetal tissue will multiply as needed within the host's body. Investigators are hopeful that ultimately insulin-dependent diabetics will be able to receive transplants and thereby recommence supplying their own insulin. Chairman Waxman, without further clinical investigation, we will never know if fetal tissue transplants can eradicate diabetes. While it is technically true that private funds can continue to be utilized to support this research, we fear that the chilling effect of this federal ban will snuff out virtually all investigative interest in this vital line of scientific inquiry. And private funds should not have to be enough. There is no rational reason why the federal government cannot support this research. Representatives of the NIH advisory panel have testified here this morning that many safeguards exist and others can be erected to ensure that the research endeavor does not influence a woman's decision to have an abortion. JDF wholeheartedly endorses NIH's recommendations in this regard. JDF has journeyed to Capitol Hill for over 15 years, asking the federal government for help, and you have responded. The government now spends about $250 million each year on diabetic research. The dividends on this investment in research have been remarkable. We have identified the genetic markers of diabetes. We have greatly reduced the health risk to mother and child of the diabetic pregnancy. We have improved methods of insulin delivery, including the use of human insulin developed through recombinant DNA, and we've discovered the insulin pump. And we have developed laser techniques which have significantly reduced the risk of blindness in diabetics. Unfortunately, because of the ban on fetal tissue, I have very little hope that we will enjoy a successful return on our investment in pancreatic tissue transplantation research. And this is disturbing because the potential for alleviating suffering and cost of diabetes and other disease is so immense. As president of the Juvenile Diabetes Foundation, I can only plead that as long as there exists an iota of opportunity that the disease can be eradicated through research utilizing any form of legalized obtained tissue from adult cadaver, from animal, from fetus, this research must be conducted. I hope that you will exercise the courage and leadership to enact legislation that would lift the administration's current ban and that would prohibit any future categorical denial of federal support for research which uses fetal tissue derived from induced abortions. The lives of millions of Americans are in the balance. I thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Mr. Monroe. Good timing. I'd like to hear from Mrs. Crowder.
My name's Ava Crowder, and y'all won't have to be told where I'm from. I'm from Texas. Did y'all know that? If you see all these gyrations and shaking and rattling and rolling I'm doing, I'm not frightened at all, neither am I nervous, but I have Parkinson's disease. And this is not a play pretty. It really is. It's Play-Doh, and it looks, I think, more dignified than wagging a ball around, but sometimes it'll help me suppress the tremor. My medication continues to be less and less effective. When I was diagnosed in January of '79 as having Parkinson's, my neurologist told me that that was an old person's disease and it took guts. And I said, I'm not old and I've got guts. But since that time, the picture has changed. It is not an old person's disease. We have a 10-year-old that she had been looking, her mother and parents had taken her from the age of 3. She had never walked from the age of 3, and she's 10 now. Until a year ago, she was diagnosed in Texas as having juvenile Parkinson's. She's taking the same medication I'm on, and up running and playing and leading a halfway normal life. She has some gyrations too. But I know from experience. Now, I think I look good, and I'm not the average Parkinsonian. I'm above the average. I work hard at trying to look nice, and I think I look pretty, don't y'all? Anyway, I'm trying to represent the 1.5 million fellow Parkinsonians, and I think that's a very conservative estimate of how many there are of us. I've given my ever-waking hour to reaching out to help. I better be careful on that issue. I have overactive tear ducts. I've tried everything. I've tried acupuncture, acupressure, illegal drugs from old Mexico smuggled across. And I'm on Cinemed, Cimatrel, Eldeprel, which, by the way, has just Depronil recently been passed by the FDA. I was under Dr. Langston's supervision with a compassionate IND, which was legal, and I've been on it since November of '85. I have not, to this date, my doctor has tried everything, but I have not been able to take the agonist, Parladel, Pergolide, which recently been made legal, and there's new one, Cabergoline, I believe, that's in the process. I go from coast to coast, speak, well, I just exhaust myself beyond your wildest imagination. You can't imagine what a schedule I have. But anyway, I try to offer hope and encouragement. I have a God-given talent to be able to reach people, and somehow people relate to me. And I'm going to make the best of what I have. I didn't have any choice in having the disease, but I have a choice of how I handle it. But ever since the fetal transplant has been in the making, I have told people we have got hope. That is the ultimate cure. At least I hyped myself and all the people I talk with up on that, and I still believe it. Medication, they're finding new medication all the time, but as you can see, and I'll tell you folks, I'm far above the average person. It's unpredictable. You never know how it's going to work. I'll tell you an incident. I try to schedule my medication where that I can function well, and I do pretty well, but yesterday morning I was exhausted. All last weekend we were filming an exercise tape in Lubbock with a physical therapist. Then I went to a conference down below San Antonio in Kerrville, so I've been pushed pretty hard. And I thought, well, I'm ahead of the guys. I'll just carry my own luggage. And I started across the courtyard, down the steps, holding on to the rail. And I crawl a lot at home, but boy, on those rocks, I didn't want to get dirty. And I was trying to get on a plane. I had a 6:30 flight. And I just stood there and prayed, and I said, Lord, I didn't have anything to lean on. I have to lean pretty, or I'll hit the floor. But I stood there and leaned on my suitcase and just prayed, and I thought, well, now I'm going to make it. But see, you never know. I try to control it, and it's getting less and less out of control. So all I'm saying is, please don't take my hope away from me and my fellow Parkinsonians. All we want is consideration to try to get well. I'm not old, and there's a lot of people a lot older than I am, but that little 10-year-old, and how do we know how many of them there are out there, undiagnosed, in a wheelchair, and told they were going to die? So let's move forward with this transplant, and please support us and have compassion for us. I don't want pity. I just want to be treated fairly, and I think it's unfair for us to not have the opportunity, and not very many people can afford to go to other countries to have the operation or know something about it. We have the greatest country in the world, so please, let's prove that we have the greatest country in the world, because we want to get well. I want to get well. First time I ever finished anything on time. Thank you, Lord.
Thank you very much. Dr. Eaton?
Mr. Chairman, thank you for this opportunity to participate in the hearing. My name is Antoinette Parisi Eaton. I'm a pediatrician at Children's Hospital in Columbus, Ohio, where I serve as the Director of Governmental Affairs. I'm also an Emerita Professor of Pediatrics and Preventive Medicine at The Ohio State University. Today I represent the American Academy of Pediatrics, for which I am the current Vice President. This organization represents office-based and hospital-based practicing pediatricians and the faculty of medical and research facilities throughout the country. We are pediatricians because we all believe in the importance of helping infants, children, and adolescents attain a meaningful and healthful life and develop into functional adults to their fullest potential and ability to contribute to our society. Mr. Chairman, this hearing was called to examine the decision to continue the ban on research projects involving fetal tissue transplantation. At present, no ongoing or proposed project can be supported through federal funding. We feel this position may be harmful in several ways. It places unnecessary limitations on biomedical research supported by the NIH, and therefore harms its reputation as a leading supporter of scientific advancement, and we do not believe it is good public policy. But most importantly, it undermines progress through new medical interventions that might be available to those infants, children, and adolescents who suffer from chronic diseases. We all know that there are many children born each year with immunodeficiencies or other genetic disorders. My particular area of clinical interest as a pediatrician has to do with children with special health care needs. For 10 years, I served as the director of the Birth Defect Center and chief of the Handicapped Child Division at the Children's Hospital. In this capacity, I was a pediatrician for many children whose conditions could not be totally corrected. They could only be assisted in maximizing their potential to lead a normal or near normal lifestyle. My testimony today, therefore, will highlight some of the issues affecting the special health needs of these children and their families, whom I know very well. Researchers continue to seek methods to help people with degenerative diseases or with disorders caused by the lack of certain cells or from dysfunctioning cells. Scientific investigations using animals indicate that one possible solution to some of these disorders would be through transplantation of new cells and/or tissue into the patient. The introduction of healthy cells or healthy tissue offers the potential for a cure by providing the normal function necessary to correct the abnormality. Preliminary indications show that theoretically beneficial uses can be made of many types of fetal cells to help these families and children. As an example, children with diabetes face a multitude of health problems which can result directly from this medical condition. Insulin treatments can help, but this is not a cure. Children with diabetes know that they will need insulin treatments as long as they live, but this insulin makes it possible for them to do those things that all children do. Current ongoing studies involving the transplantation of pancreatic islet cells in children with diabetes show such therapies make a dramatic difference and may make a difference in the future for these children. Other examples of importance include children with immune deficiencies. There are infants born with a condition known as DeGeorge's syndrome. Some of the features of the complete form of this syndrome, which includes an absence of the thymus, can be surgically corrected, it is true, but the total lack of a thymus results in susceptibility to infection that usually leads to death before the infant is 1 year old. Some years ago, it was discovered that the syndrome, which includes an absence of the thymus, can be surgically corrected, it is true, but the total lack of a thymus results in susceptibility to infection that usually leads to death before the infant is 1 year old. Some years ago, it was discovered that the implantation of fetal thymic tissue was successful and corrected the deficiency in some of these infants. Obviously, a number of congenital anomalies and disorders which affect our children may benefit from fetal transplantation. I am here today to urge this committee to recognize that these conditions are not listing of medical textbook topics, but impact on the individual infants, children, and adolescents whom pediatricians see every day. How do you tell a family about the emotional, social, and financial problems which they will face due to the chronic illness or chronic disability of a child? And I've been in that position on many occasions. How does a pediatrician explain that limitations have been set upon the extent to which research can be undertaken to prevent, treat, or cure their child's condition? The American Academy of Pediatrics recognizes that there are serious moral issues involved with the use of fetal tissue and transplantation therapy. However, these issues were debated in an open forum before the NIH panel, representing the medical, legal, scientific, and ethical aspects of the issue, and a comprehensive report with recommendations was published, as noted by previous reporters. This report was endorsed by the NIH Directors Advisory Committee and submitted to the Assistant Secretary for Health. The decision by the Human Fetal Tissue Transplantation Panel was that research using fetal tissue for transplantation should proceed with strict and severe guidelines. The Academy supports such a position. This is evidenced by the fact that the Academy also helped to develop and support the statement of the Federation of Pediatric Organizations. The Federation states in part that there should be no compensation to the donor of the fetal tissue, there must be no direct contact between the scientific researcher and the donor, and that there can be no specific recipient designated by the donor. The enormous potential that exists for helping and curing children through fetal tissue transplantation should not be diminished. Current research into the use of fetal cells holds great promise. As pediatricians, we want to see such vital work continued for the benefit of the affected children and their families. I thank you for the opportunity to appear before you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Eaton. Mrs. Colvin, we want to hear from you. I wonder if you could pass the microphone over to, or either way, there's one on each side.
Yeah, that's fine. Mr. Chairman, thank you for allowing me this opportunity to come testify today. My name is Karen Colvin. I am a 36-year-old registered nurse and quadriplegic, and I come to you today representing a variety of populations. I am the director of a national hotline that addresses the concerns of more than 1.5 million paralyzed Americans who suffer with a spinal cord injury, increasing each year by about 10,000. Spinal cord injury is a particularly devastating affliction because it most often happens to young people. Spinal cord injuries are the result of accidents, automobile, diving, falls, and violence. The average age at injury is 19 years old. A perfectly healthy, normal young person suddenly and violently becomes paralyzed in an instant. An entire lifetime is radically changed. Every day since 1984, when I founded the hotline, I hear the frustrations, pain, anguish, and financial burdens that this growing group is faced with. Paralysis burdens the family and drains government dollars in health care needs and financial aid. As a nurse, I understand the clinical aspects of this disability. As a human being, my frustration grows with each phone call I receive. 7 years ago, I was hit by a reckless driver, rendering me a quadriplegic, paralyzed from the chest down with minimal hand movement. At the time of my injury, I was a mother to a 6-year-old daughter and a 4-year-old son. My 16-year marriage has survived, but not without its trials and tribulations. My children, who are 13 and 11 today, also have withstood the trauma caused by my injury, but they have been denied a wife and mother who cannot fully share in the activities of life that an able-bodied parent experiences. I am someone's mother, someone's wife, someone's daughter, and I could be yours, and I could be Dr. Mason's. Finally, I represent the board of directors of the American Paralysis Association, whose organization has provided printed testimony in your packet, whose primary concern is with the millions of disabled persons in our country and around the world who want to walk again. The American Paralysis Association has invested more than $4.5 million in research activities aimed at achieving a cure for paralysis. The subject of abortion is, to say the least, a most sensitive one. How it will be resolved is not for me to address. It is not necessary, however, to justify elective abortion in order to justify fetal cell research. Women will have abortions whether or not there is fetal cell research. The ban on federally funded research using human fetal cell tissue conflicts with the report of the 1988 research panel of NIH. The law that forbids the sale of human organs should be amended to ban the sale of fetal tissue, eliminating any motivation for terminating a pregnancy. Given this reality, the question is what to do with the remains of the fetus. It can be disposed of as other surgical specimens are, or it can be served as a donor for research or transplant purposes in accordance with the provisions of the Uniform Anatomical Gift Act. I believe the latter response demonstrates far more regard for human life. In this world where good health and long life is promoted, your committee must deal with the other side of the spectrum. Nothing would give me and the hundreds of thousands of wheelchair users across this nation to be able to walk up the steps of our nation's Capitol and look down at our accomplishment. I thank you very much.
Very much. Mr. and Mrs. Jacobson.
Mr. Chairman, my name is Trudy Jacobson. My husband Howard and I appreciate this opportunity to speak to you today on behalf of the more than 3 million people with epilepsy. On July 25, 1989, President Bush signed into law Public Law 101-58, declaring that the 1990s are the decade of the brain. As the parents of a young child with uncontrolled seizures, we were excited that the federal government was committing itself to focus government attention on research, treatment, and rehabilitation in the area of disorders and disabilities that affect the brain. We were hopeful that this declaration would not be an idle promise, but would instead be backed up by real action. The current moratorium undermines the letter and spirit of that law. Our son looks like the typical American kid. He was even born on the 4th of July and is convinced that the annual fireworks display is in his honor. Jeremy has the most beautiful brown eyes and a very infectious smile that lights up his face. But the fact is that Jeremy is not normal. He has epilepsy. When most people hear that Jeremy has epilepsy, they assume that his condition can be controlled by drugs. While that is true for more than half the people with seizures, Jeremy's seizures are not controlled.
Jeremy suffers from several kinds of seizures, most of which barely manifest themselves to the eye, but nonetheless severely disturb his normal functioning. Unlike most victims of seizure disorders, Jeremy's condition has been threatening to his cognitive abilities and appears within the last 6 months to have become more progressive. The seizures have also caused him to become a partial hemiplegic, that is, he does not have full use of his left side, especially his hand. Can you imagine being 6 years old and not knowing whether you can rely upon your brain or your body? Jeremy is aware of the fact that he has seizures. With some of the seizures, he can tell you while they are occurring. He never knows from day to day what he can expect from his own body. His life is both a physical and emotional roller coaster, with seizures every 30 to 50 seconds while he is awake and basically non-stop while he was asleep. It's nearly impossible for Jeremy to function. Although he becomes very frustrated at times, he keeps on trying. In school, Jeremy requires a special chair so that he does not fall down. He receives 2 hours a week of individual physical, occupational, and speech therapy from the schools and has nearly 2 hours a day of individual instruction in 15-minute clusters because he cannot function in a group structure or for a longer period of time.
We have tried everything suggested to control Jeremy's seizures. He's been treated with all but one of the primary anticonvulsants, individually and in assorted combinations, along with a few unconventional drug therapies in the hope of controlling the seizures. He spent a year and a half of hell on the ketogenic diet. How would you like to be limited to 900 calories a day, of which 80% are fat, such as mayonnaise, butter, and heavy whipping cream? In all fairness, the diet did stop the very dangerous drop attacks he was having 50 to 100 times a day, but left him in clinical depression at age 4, and a place of honor on his physician's wall due to his cholesterol level in excess of 500. After 2.5 years of therapy, Jeremy is remarkably well adjusted, given what he has been and will continue to go through.
When we recently asked Jeremy's neurologist to give us some clue as to the prognosis, we were told that if we can't gain some consistent control sometime over the next 10 years, Jeremy may become seriously retarded. Realistically, the best we can hope for is that some new combination of drugs will kick in and control his seizures for more than a few weeks so that he can become a functioning person and eventually a functioning adult. At the present time, surgery does not appear to be a viable option, and no new anticonvulsant drugs have appeared in well over 10 years. So at this point, we have learned to face one day at a time. Nonetheless, it's a difficult pill for us to swallow. We are very fast losing hope that his seizures will ever be fully controlled.
For years, Jeremy has stumped the experts. His seizures are of unknown origin. They have been maturing or at least changing over the last 4 years. Jeremy's neurologists now believe that his seizures may be metabolic in nature. These seizures are among the most difficult to control and are one of the areas scientists are now exploring. Jeremy's only hope is that additional research will develop new methods to control his seizures. Scientists know all too little about the functioning of the brain and what causes seizures. New technologies such as the MRI and PET scans are aiding doctors in diagnosing the causes and treatment of seizures. But that is not enough. As Congress and President Bush stated last year, we must commit ourselves to do more.
Mr. Chairman, 17 years ago, my dad died when he had a blood clot become lodged in his heart. If that occurred today, medicine has advanced to the point where he would probably be with us today. I don't want to lose my son or deny him opportunities to grow simply because medical research is now not allowed to proceed. The moratorium stands in the way of vital research that may lead to the cure for, or perhaps at least a method of controlling Jeremy's seizures, as well as the suffering of people suffering from other debilitating diseases. We recognize that the research involving fetal tissues may eventually lead down a blind alley in our case, but it's an alley that must be explored. A failure to do so sends a message that the federal government has abandoned those people that nature has already disadvantaged. Our only hope is for a major new breakthrough. Don't foreclose what little opportunity we have. Regardless of one's position on abortion, if the procedural safeguards recommended by the Transplantation Research Panel in its December '88 report are followed, federal support for medical research involving fetal tissues is really the only true pro-life position. To paraphrase one of your colleagues a while back, our commitment to life should not begin at conception and end at birth. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I want to thank all of you. You've given compelling, powerful testimony, not to the point of saying that you know for sure that there's going to be a breakthrough, but you don't want to be denied that chance. You don't want to be denied that hope through scientific research that those people in your lives or you yourself that are affected by one disease or another may be able to be cured or helped tremendously. It's very frustrating to you and to all of us as we look at this issue to imagine that research that may lead to those breakthroughs won't even be permitted, even if that research has been approved by the scientific peer reviewers as important and valid and promising, even though the research can lead to understanding and breakthroughs that can save lives. I agree with you. This is a pro-life position to say that we want scientific research to be able to go forward in this country. Now, we do have this question of fetal tissue transplants. Dr. Mason testified a few minutes ago that he thought that this may lead to more induced abortions. Somebody on the panel a minute ago pointed out that one of the recommendations of the Adams panel was that there not be permitted a contact between a researcher and a woman who may be considering the decision of an abortion. I raised with Dr. Mason a few minutes ago perhaps some other place to draw the line to allow more fetal tissue that results from an abortion that wasn't based on a desire of the woman to help research be permitted for these projects. There are other ways to draw the line and to figure out what restrictions might be appropriate for fear that there may be an inducement of more abortions. But Dr. Mason didn't have public hearings, Mr. Monroe, you pointed out. He didn't put out a regulation proposal and ask for people to comment, which is the usual way decisions are to be made. He didn't ask if there are other ways to look at this question and to resolve the various competing moral questions. He simply made a decision based on his fear and belief of what may happen, for which we have no evidence at the present time that such a thing would happen. His fear was that there would be more abortions. Our fear is that his decision will keep more people sick and disabled because the research won't be permitted. Perhaps an orderly procedure in the regular way might have led him even to a different conclusion. But the fact of the matter is, even if we weren't able to change his mind, he should not be the only one to make this decision. He is not the only one to decide this relative balance. We asked a commission, a panel set up by NIH to evaluate the matter, and they came up with a different conclusion, not by a narrow vote, but by an overwhelming vote. Their recommendation went to an advisory committee for the Department of Health and Human Services, and they adopted it unanimously. Now we have this thing stopped in its tracks and no research being permitted because of the views of two people that we know of in this administration, Mr. Mason, Dr. Mason, and Dr. Sullivan. And I also believe it's not just their personal views. It's the political decision within this administration that is making this decision. A political decision that this administration wants to side with the most extreme anti-abortion thinking wherever it may be found. That was the basis for this administration's decision to say that Washington, D.C. could not use its own funds if their elected officials decided to permit women to have abortions under the Medicaid program. That's what led the President of the United States to follow the advice of those who recommended to him not to permit, even for the purposes of aborting a pregnancy due to rape or incest, not to allow the Medicaid program for that purpose. And now in this research question, this ideological position being superimposed over medical research and the chance for hope for breakthroughs. I really have no questions to ask you because there's nothing I could ask you that you haven't already said to me and made the case so powerfully already. let me thank you very much for being here. All of you have been tremendous. I think that this decision has to be one to be made by the representatives of the people. And we're going to pursue this issue legislatively because we're forced to, since the administration decided the matter politically based on this ideological extreme view. And I think the testimony you've given is the most powerful reason why we have to change that decision that has been made in the way it has been made. Thank you very much. The two witnesses testifying on our fourth panel are appearing in support of the administration's decision to ban fetal tissue transplantation research. Dr. Jonathan H. Pincus is professor and chairman, Department of Neurology at Georgetown University Hospital. Dr. Keith A. Crutcher is associate professor in the Department of Neurosurgery at the University of Cincinnati. And I'd like these two gentlemen to come forward. We're pleased to welcome you to our subcommittee hearing. Your prepared statements will be in the record in full. We'd like to ask each of you, if you would, to limit your oral presentation to no more than 5 minutes. And Dr. Pincus, why don't we start with you, but be sure to pull the mic over.
Even from the point of view of a person who has no ethical problem with abortion, the moratorium has a favorable side. There's an unjustified assumption on the part of both sides of this controversy to the effect that transplants offer a promising mode of therapy for Parkinson's disease, particularly Parkinson's disease, but also for Alzheimer's disease, spinal cord injury, Huntington's chorea. These are some of the conditions that have been mentioned here this morning. In my opinion, both sides are wrong in this. The history of neurology and of medicine is littered with abandoned surgical procedures and medical therapies whose initial promise was unfulfilled. For example, operations in Parkinson's disease, to treat Parkinson's disease, have included destructive procedures directed at parts of the brain, the globus pallidus, thalamus, and motor pathways. Some, few, very few, patients were helped temporarily. Many patients mistakenly thought they had been helped, as did their doctors, because of a placebo effect. Many hundreds of operations on patients resulted, with disastrous results for many, no effect on most, and success for a very few. The introduction of L-DOPA to medical practice ended these operations as respectable or common modes of therapy for Parkinson's disease. L-DOPA has revolutionized the lives of patients with Parkinson's disease, and the effects of the introduction of that medication on patients with Parkinson's disease who had been hospitalized in nursing homes was movingly described by Oliver Sacks in a book called Awakenings. As Parkinson's disease advances, L-DOPA can become less effective. This results from one of two kinds of things. One is there's worsening dopamine deficiency, and the other is that other parts of the brain start to degenerate as well, not just the dopamine pathways. In other words, there's motor system of the brain beyond dopamine deficiency. If substantia nigra transplants from fetuses work, and this is highly questionable, they could only reverse dopamine deficiency. They could not help to reverse the unresponsiveness to dopamine that progressive motor disease imposes. How does a physician differentiate these two conditions? Well, by replacing dopamine. If this succeeds, why not continue that? Does a patient who responds to oral DOPA therapy need a brain transplant? If replacement therapy fails, then a transplant will not help. Parkinson's disease is the only degenerative neurological disease that can be treated effectively with replacement therapy, and therefore the selection of patients for fetal transplant is plagued by this unresolvable paradox in Parkinson's disease. If your therapy, DOPA, works, the person doesn't need a transplant. If it doesn't work, he can't use it. Parkinson's disease is the only disease of those considered candidates for fetal brain transplants, a therapy which does not involve the regeneration of particular specific contacts between nerve cells, as would spinal cord injury, Alzheimer's, or Huntington's chorea. There's no evidence whatever that the replacement of a substance by a biological pump, and that's what fetal cells would be if they worked, would provide any benefit whatever to those conditions. The only condition in which it could possibly work would be Parkinson's disease. And the reason that we know that is because replacement therapy works in Parkinson's disease. There's not a whit of evidence that replacement therapy of any sort works in those other conditions. Now, what if the cells were a drug that were to be placed in the brain to release dopamine? The Food and Drug Administration would want to know some things about it before it was used in human beings. What would be the result of that? Can it produce a more severe movement disorder? Can it produce psychosis, hallucinations, severe depression? All of these are complications of the use of DOPA, and the use of a biological pump might lead to those conditions. Could it cause cancer of the brain? Can it activate latent viruses in the brain? Could AIDS be transmitted or other viruses be introduced? Are there long-term dangers, in other words, in these transplants? Or are bilateral operations necessary? These questions would be addressed by years of research with animals, by many groups of researchers in using several species. This has not been done for fetal transplants. My concern is not that the United States will fail to be the first to operate on the brains of Parkinson patients, or that our researchers are going to be dispirited, or that patients who unrealistically hope for a cure will be disappointed. The Mexican neurosurgeons recently pioneered adrenal cell transplants in Parkinson's disease, with glowing reports of success reported in the New England Journal of Medicine. American surgeons hurried to catch up. The conclusion now is that it doesn't work. They beat us to the punch. But what was the punch? The punch was that several hundred old people have been subjected to adrenalectomies and craniotomies with no benefit and at considerable risk to them. It has been said that more humans were subjected to adrenal cell transplants than animals. The same should not be done with fetal transplants. Though a greater animal experimental background with regard to fetal than adrenal transplants exists, it is still inadequate. If it were a drug, it would not be approved. If this operation is funded by the NIH, it will become popular, and research will be focused on humans, not animals. And there will be difficulty in limiting the inducements. I know myself of a daughter who offered to get pregnant so she could be aborted so that that fetus could be used to treat her father. There's a problem of poor to the rich and undeveloped countries to developed countries, and having a flow of cells go that way. Thank you.
Thank you. We're pleased to have you with us.
Yeah, I'd also like to extend my appreciation for being offered to provide my own testimony on this issue. And since my expertise is in the field of neuroscience, I'm most familiar with the research involving studies requiring fetal brain tissue. Although the opinions expressed on my own, I would like to request that Appendix 2 be entered into the record along with my written statement. This appendix consists of a statement signed by 41 physicians and scientists who object to the use of human fetal tissue derived from elective abortion. I will briefly summarize my own reasons for objecting to this practice. First of all, I do not think it is possible to separate, either on practical or ethical grounds, the practice of abortion from the use of tissue derived from the abortus. Secondly, there does not appear to be any way in which informed consent can be obtained for such experimentation. Thirdly, current criteria for defining fetal death are insufficient to ensure against human vivisection. Fourthly, I cannot condone any research that is based on the sole use of individuals as a means to an end. I do find it of interest, however, that the attributes of human fetal tissue that make it desirable for therapeutic research, namely that it is unquestionably human, that it is alive, and that it has tremendous developmental potential, are some of the same attributes that convince me that the fetus deserves protection. Most of the objections I raise have been formulated by others in great detail, so I will limit my summary to those points that seem to be most pivotal in understanding the issues. The arguments that the practice of abortion can be separated from the use of fetal tissue strike me as post hoc rationalizations in order to justify the use of the abortus. Clearly, the possibility of fetal tissue transplantation becoming standard medical therapy is dependent on the continued practice of abortion. Whether fetal tissue therapy will in turn have an effect on the practice of abortion is a moot point that awaits specific data, and I would support your concern, Mr. Waxman, that the data is not available on one side or the other. However, collection of the data presupposes the policy in question. I concur with the Secretary of Health that the risk of additional inducement for abortion justifies the current moratorium, emphasizing that it's my personal opinion there is no data one way or the other on that issue. However, I think there are even more compelling reasons for objecting to the use of human fetal tissue. In all other areas of medicine, great care has been taken to ensure that individuals are not subjected to medical experimentation without consent. I am convinced by the arguments made by others that such consent is not obtainable in the case of the electively aborted fetus, because there is no individual who is qualified to represent the interests of the fetus. Even if the preceding objections did not apply, I am convinced that the use of neural tissue obtained from aborted fetuses often involves the practice of vivisection. This is a consequence of the fact that the fetus is neither brain dead, since the brain tissue needed for transplantation needs to be living, nor anesthetized. And I would like to respectfully correct Mr. Waxman's statement that this is referring to dead tissue. The tissue is not useful if it is dead. Although the precedent for this policy may already be considered established by the current practice of abortion, which often represents vivisection in utero, I don't think we can use this as a justification for vivisection ex utero. It is also of relevance that there does not exist an independent, unbiased agent for determining fetal death in such cases. Finally, one need not link the practice of abortion to the experimental use of the abortus in order to object to both activities on the grounds that both involve the utilization of one segment of society for the benefit of others. In the case of abortion, the presumed beneficiaries are those women who seek abortion. In the case of fetal tissue experimentation, the potential beneficiaries are the patients who would be treated to the transplantation procedure. Although our society currently abrogates any rights of the fetus on the basis that women have their ultimate control over their own bodies, it is difficult to understand why the same principle does not apply to the fetuses once they have been disconnected from the life support provided by the mother. On the other hand, if elective abortion can be justified on moral grounds, as many have proposed, I do not see why we should take great measures to separate the practice of abortion from the experimental or therapeutic use of the fetal tissue. Surely, if a woman can choose to abort for any reason by virtue of her right to choose, she should be allowed to abort for the purpose of donating fetal tissue for compassionate reasons or for profit. I suspect that the strong desire to separate the two issues stems from a begrudging recognition that we have already stepped over the line that normally serves to protect the individuals in our society from wrongful death or exploitation. My objections are in potential conflict with my personal goals to succeed as a professional scientist and to contribute to the relief of pain and suffering from neurological disease. In appearing before you, I recognize that I invite potential disfavor among my scientific colleagues who support or engage in this research. I could also potentially benefit by the availability of federal funds in this area because my research goals are similar, namely the treatment of neurological disease and injury. I very much have the same feeling of compassion for all those panelists who sat here pleading for this kind of research. However, my conscience prevents me from engaging in such research or seeking such federal support. I do not want to leave the impression that human fetal tissue transplantation is the only or even the most effective approach to treating a neurological disease. And Dr. Pink has summarized some of the issues on that point quite eloquently. Apart from my strong ethical objections to this research, I am not convinced that such an approach has been shown to be generally effective, or when effective, that it is more therapeutic than currently available treatments, an issue that has not been discussed in sufficient detail, in my opinion. I hope the patients suffering from neurological disease or injury will not be persuaded that we are abandoning their plight by seeking the protection of even more vulnerable members of our society. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your testimony. Dr. Pincus, as I understood your testimony, you just don't think this research is likely to be all that successful. Is that your view?
That's part of it, yes. I would like to see a lot more animal work than human, or at least to precede any kind of human work. Mm-hmm. And the kind of human work I would like to see is the kind that where you took some fetal cells from some cell line, kept them alive, and engineered them with DNA so they could produce dopamine. Then you could try that, it seems to me, but that should be done in animals before it's done in humans. Mm-hmm. With the adrenal transplants, we had an awful lot more animals than, an awful lot more people who had that than animals.
You do believe at some point research is permissible on humans?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah. So your disagreement is with those scientists who believe that a particular research project involving human beings should go forward. You think that it may be premature to have those kinds of research projects.
That's right.
Okay. Dr. Crutcher, as I understand your view, you're saying that you said your conscience prevents you from supporting any of the research, and that's because your conscience is concerned about the death of the fetus?
About the means of the death.
From your point of view, you find it unconscionable to have an abortion under any circumstances?
No. What I'm saying is that there's been a long history in medical research to make sure we derive informed consent. And I do not think it is possible in this circumstance to derive such consent.
Well, you certainly can't get informed consent from a fetus.
Exactly.
And you don't believe the mother could give the informed consent?
I think the mother disqualifies herself by virtue of intending to abort.
And what if they're a court-appointed guardian?
I think that potentially one could try to derive a third-party consent system. However, I don't think the current circumstances permit such a consent because the practitioners of the abortion are clearly unqualified, and the practitioners who would use the tissue would also be unqualified because all have a vested interest in the use of the tissue.
And therefore your conscience says that even though this may well help some other people to survive and to be cured from diseases, that's not sufficient reason.
Well, I think my conscience says that, just as my compassion for those victims of neurological disease deserve all the support and research that we can muster, that it must never infringe upon the rights of others to obtain that information.
Some state laws permit organ transplants from deceased adults without informed consent. Do you think that those laws ought to be stopped?
My understanding is that it's only the case for corneal transplantation. And I think that in that case there is the presumed consent basis, which means that one presumes that if the person had the opportunity to provide consent that they would do so. I think that this is an issue that needs to be debated and perhaps looked at very strongly as to whether or not such an argument could be used to justify fetal tissue donation. I don't think it has been looked at. I personally question whether or not that would be a valid basis for such consent.
Okay. Well, thank you both for your testimony. I appreciate your being here. Our last witness is Dr. John C. Fletcher, who's long been involved with the ethical issues surrounding fetal tissue research. Currently, Dr. Fletcher is director of the Center for Biomedical Ethics at the Health Sciences Center of the University of Virginia. For the 10 years prior to his appointment at the University of Virginia, Dr. Fletcher was ethicist in residence at the NIH. Dr. Fletcher, we're pleased to have you with us today.
Thank you.
Your prepared statement will be made part of the record in full. We'd like to ask of you to limit your oral presentation to 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for inviting me to testify. My testimony says, Mr. Chairman, that the reasoning given by the Secretary of Health and Human Services for extending the moratorium is deeply flawed and, in my view, borders on the irresponsible. However, this moratorium can be better understood by seeing it in a historical context. That is, the moratorium is only the latest chapter in a long pattern of obstruction and disregard for due process to public process. This pattern of obstruction, in my view, amounts to suppression, and this is the only area of science that is suppressed in our otherwise free society. It's suppressed in the federal sector, in various types of research linked to the human fetus or embryo. Finally, I have to conclude, without making any judgments on the motives of the individuals, that the consequences of continuing this pattern, and especially the consequences of continuing the moratorium, amount to a policy of moral recklessness in the face of great and undeserved human suffering. There's a flaw in the Secretary's reasoning which amounts to a very large logical fallacy. The fallacy is called begging the question. Namely, Secretary Mason said it this morning, has a premise that fetal tissue transplant research will causally increase the incidence of abortion by motivating women who are in doubt about abortion to have one. This premise is assumed to be true, has been pointed out by you and by many, without any evidence or warrant. Mr. Chairman, in my view, it borders on the irresponsible for the Secretary of the nation's primary resource for biomedical knowledge to attribute a causal relationship between fetal tissue transplantation research and the incidence of abortion without citing a single shred of evidence to support his argument. As Dr. Walters said, the burden of proof on the basis of evidence is on anyone who would make this claim. However, when you examine various ways of studying this question, it's very difficult to imagine studying it without insulting many, many women who would have to be approached to imagine their actions in the context of abortion. There's also a very serious ethical problem with the Secretary's argument because he accepts research in the private sector but not research in the public sector. Does the Secretary mean that what he's called wrong and the federal sector is not wrong in the private sector? Are there two moral worlds, one federal and one private? You can understand this inconsistency better, Mr. Chairman, if you see it as part of a 10-year history of suppression of scientific activities in the federal sector having to do with the human fetus or embryo. I've spelled out this history in the second part of my testimony. However, the consequences of it, in that virtually no research with the human fetus is permitted with federal funds today. This has been true for many years. No research is permitted with the human embryo. Mr. Chairman, I find it a wrenching contradiction that our country permits research of considerable risk with living children, and does not permit research with virtually any risk, and does not permit any research with the fetus or with the human embryo. However, the most ethically troubling problem to me, Mr. Chairman, is the distressing liberties taken with due process and with the public process and public bioethics that the country had gotten used to in the 1970s and in the early 1980s. No national forum for discussion of these specific projects exists. The NIH panel would not have been appointed if there had been a legitimate ethical advisory board in place. There has been a deliberate attempt to keep an ethical advisory board from being rechartered, both in the previous administration and in this administration. Conflict about abortion, Mr. Chairman, rather than scientific considerations or rationally debatable moral considerations, have dominated federal research policy concerning the human embryo or fetus. This is a sad story in American history. We pride ourselves on our public and scientific freedom, but legitimate science in reproductive biology is a hostage in the federal sector today. In my view, compared to France, the United Kingdom, Canada, or Sweden, the U.S. is presently in the throes of a paralysis of public bioethics. Public bioethics, Mr. Chairman, is conducted behind closed doors today, that is in terms of the decision-making about momentous issues like this. So I thank you for calling these hearings. I have to conclude, quite apart from, I don't think I'm asked to judge the motives of any individual, but I'm here to help assess the consequences of a policy. When viewed in its consequences, the moratorium and the pattern it continues can be called a policy of moral recklessness in the face of great undeserved human suffering. And I'll be glad to discuss why I think this in the discussion if there's time. Thank you for inviting me to testify.
Thank you very much, Dr. Fletcher, for that very thoughtful testimony. You were at NIH for 10 years, and you've observed the agency even after you left. Are you aware of any other unanimous advisory committee recommendation that was rejected?
No, Mr. Chairman.
As an ethicist, do you believe that the morality of abortion is more important than the morality of preventing disability and death?
No, Mr. Chairman, but in comparative terms, there are reasons for abortion that are more morally justifiable than other reasons. But when you compare the two moralities side by side, the burden of proof, I think, is on anyone who would prevent good coming from the fetal tissue that is the product of abortion choices. And the administration's argument do not pass the burden of proof.
What bothers me so much in this whole debate is that there are no gray areas that people see and try to deal with in a very real, practical way. They see black or they see white. Abortion, for whatever circumstance, seems to be considered wrong, even though it's legal, and even though many people, from a very strong moral point of view, would think that abortion is the right moral decision. There are abortions, of course, that we would say were wrong morally. The whole question then of whether we're going to have research. Dr. Mason didn't think we shouldn't have. His view was that we should have research. He wasn't against research. He was just afraid that research would encourage abortions. Well, we set up a panel to look at that question. They came up with some very practical ways to try to keep that from happening. Stopping a direction of fetal tissue to any particular person, making sure we wouldn't permit sale of it, making sure there would be no contact between researchers and pregnant women. We could add others. There maybe ought to be counseling for a woman who's about to have an abortion to make sure that she's not considering the abortion solely for the reason of donating the tissue. There seems to me, if there's a matter here that's real, it should be addressed in a very practical way, but we see black and white. This last witness before you said the fetus can't give informed consent. The mother who wants to destroy the fetus isn't the one to give consent. Therefore, no consent can be given. Therefore, no fetal tissue can be used. The result is not that there aren't going to be abortions. The result is that the product of those abortions will simply be dumped, buried, like refuse somewhere, even though the product of abortions could, under some circumstances, save lives, could lead to breakthroughs, could fulfill dreams and hopes for people that are suffering. I just can't understand this view of morality without weighing competing questions and trying to decide where morality really lies, where the right moral choice really lies. This blindness to anything other than a rigid position.
That's why I call this a policy of moral recklessness. Recklessness has three characteristics. It lacks caution. This policy is based on a lack of caution in that it has an unexamined premise and no proof. It creates unreasonable risk of harm to others. And there's a lack of foresight about consequences of the actions. I didn't see an environmental impact statement, Mr. Chairman, accompanying the Secretary's letter. I saw no serious analysis of any point.
He didn't even propose it in a way that would allow input from anyone else, just simply a ban without further thought, without further evaluation of his point of view.
And Secretary Mason said here this morning that even if this caused one abortion to be induced for, in his terms, the wrong reason, that this would be a reason why the administration would continue to impose the moratorium, imposing a moratorium that is based on a premise which, by his own words, cannot, and I think he said should not even be studied. I ask you, Mr. Chairman, what kind of public policy this is, and I congratulate you for calling these fallacies about the way public policy is being made into public scrutiny. I think that when the American people learn this story about how research has been suppressed in this country for more than 10 years and see the price that we are paying and listen to their counterparts in other countries about the reasoning that they use in permitting this research, the American people will begin to turn around.
Let me ask you this. You've worked at NIH. You've had an opportunity to talk to researchers. What impact does this have on the morale of people, either who continue research or who leave research because they see promising research just stop for political reasons?
It's very serious, Mr. Chairman. Many of the best researchers at the NIH in genetics, in embryology, in those who are interested in the causes of infertility and embryology, have left the NIH because they cannot do research there. The effect upon the neurosciences at the NIH in particular, and the neurosurgeons, who are just as capable as Swedish neurosurgeons, Mr. Chairman, of transplanting fetal tissue, has been very harsh. I was part of the group that considered the very first experiment in 1986, and I helped the researchers think through the ethical considerations and the informed consent considerations of that experiment to give Parkinson's patients a choice as to whether they wanted adrenal autotransplants or fetal tissue transplants. That was the experiment, and that was the issue that was put on Dr. Weingarten's desk. He decided, for reasons of his own, to have this decision reviewed. You said yourself, Mr. Chairman, he did not have to do that. He asked for that review. There being no ethical advisory board, then the NIH had to set up this panel. So the NIH is trapped in the manipulations that have created this situation. It took an unconscionable amount of time to get decisions made in this area, so that research was delayed all that time. But to go back to your question, it seriously harmed morale. It affects research in other areas. Those who are working on human gene therapy, been in discussion with them recently, point out the bad effects because they're not going to be able to learn whether fetal tissue transplant research helps with genetic diseases. In other words, juvenile diabetes is a genetic disease. Anything you can learn in trying to treat one genetic disease can be applied in a chain of scientific reasoning about other diseases. But, Mr. Chairman,
I thank you, Dr. Fletcher, for your answer. Let me just conclude this hearing by making note of the fact that George Bush has been president for a year and 3 months or so. Over a quarter of his term as President of the United States. We still don't even have a director at the National Institutes of Health. And the reason we don't even have a director appointed is because all candidates to be in that position are grilled on their views on abortion and research involving fetuses. And even some of the researchers who agree with the administration's opposition to abortion are so offended that this is the only thing they want to know about, that they, as scientists, don't feel they want to be part of an administration and to head the NIH under those circumstances. I appreciate your testimony. I thank all the witnesses here today. We'll continue to work on this issue, and I hope from my point of view, which I in no way am hiding from anyone, that the decision of Dr. Sullivan and Dr. Mason will be overturned. That concludes our business today, and we stand adjourned.
John, as usual.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
We will take a break now for some programming information. First, we have a reminder that we will bring you coverage from this past week in Strasbourg, France, where C-SPAN interviewed a number of members of the European Parliament. That begins Sunday at 1 p.m. Eastern Time, 10 a.m. on the West Coast. From the nation's capital, you're watching